let's talk about how the Vikings took over the map without ever building an empire. It didn't begin in the 8th century, not really. That's just when the monks started writing things down when blood hit the page at Lindisfarne, and someone finally bothered to give a name to the people who came from the sea. But long before anyone scrawled Northmen in a margin, long before the Franks began buying peace with silver, long before the word Viking existed at all, there were ships and men inside them buried together under the northern soil. They left no written language, no empire, no monuments themselves, but they did leave ghosts, and one of them resurfaced on a quiet Estonian island not too long ago. In the summer of 2011, during routine roadwork on Saaremaa, a sleepy Baltic island north of Latvia, workers accidentally cut through a low mound of earth. It didn't look like much, just a rise in the grass, but buried inside was a ship, and inside the ship, bodies, dozens of them, some hacked to pieces, others clutching weapons, vertebrae severed, arms missing. One had been decapitated, all of them men, all of them young, and buried with them, as if someone knew the grave would matter, were spears, shields, combs, and a single gaming piece carved from a whale's tooth. This was no ordinary tomb. This was a boat burial, one of the largest and oldest ever found in Europe. And it was not alone. Only a few meters away they found a second ship, smaller, but older. Inside it were more men, also dead, also armed. But the wounds here were different, not quite as violent. One had been laid gently with his hands crossed. Another had a blade at his side and a protective talisman around his neck. They hadn't died in battle, or at least not at the same time, but whoever buried them believed they belonged to the same story. 2 ships, 40 bodies, no written records, and not a single sign of local origin. When the bones were carbon dated, the results were stranger than expected. These men had died sometime in the early 7th century, around the year 620, a full 150 years before the first recorded Viking raid. Yet the ships were unmistakably Scandinavian. The weapons, the brooches, even the boat-building style matched burial customs seen later in Norway and Sweden, which meant that long before the so-called Viking Age officially began, long before the English chroniclers started panicking about sea wolves and heathens, young men from the north were already crossing the Baltic to fight and die in coordinated maritime warfare. But what were they doing there? Some believe the Saaremaa burial is evidence of an early failed raid. Perhaps they attacked a rival tribe, were defeated, and buried by their surviving comrades. Others argue it was a diplomatic mission, a failed alliance or trade agreement turned violent. But the truth is, we don't know, and that in some ways is more important, because it reminds us that history does not begin with documentation. It begins with motion. With someone picking up a tool or stepping onto a boat or leaving behind a body buried just deep enough to go unnoticed until a backhoe catches the corner of a hull. The clean textbook version says the raids began in the year 793 with the attack onto the monastery at Lindisfarne. A neat beginning. Monks killed, gold stolen, pagans blamed. But this narrative is less a beginning than a warning written in ink. The real story, the story of the Sea Kings, starts in silence with no one left alive to tell it. The Saaremaa find isn't an isolated case. Across the Baltic, archaeologists have uncovered signs of Scandinavian movement well before the infamous Age of Plunder. In the Russian river systems, Scandinavian trade goods appear in sites dating back to the 6th and 7th centuries. In Denmark, stone markers and burial customs show contact with the Franks and Saxons long before written records acknowledge such contact. And in Gotland, that cold flat island in the middle of the Baltic Sea, vast hoards of silver and Arabic coins suggest not only trade but ambition. Someone long before Lindisfarne was already laying the economic groundwork for what would become the Viking web. Someone was mapping a world. But perhaps most haunting of all is what these early burials do not include: Christian symbols. There are no crosses, no inscriptions, no prayers carved into stone. These were pagan men's sons of a worldview that saw life and death as part of a cycle guided by fate, not mercy. To die in battle was to earn honour. To be buried in a ship was to journey into the afterlife, sails drawn by wind or fire. Even the grave-goods swords, drinking horns, combs suggest a belief in continuity, in carrying one's tools into the next world. These men did not see themselves as primitive or expendable. They were warriors, traders, explorers, and perhaps in their own minds, kings. But they had no empire. This is one of the strangest facts about the early Viking world. Unlike the Romans or the Persians or even the Celts, the Scandinavians never built a unified political system. There were local chieftains, yes, regional kings, great men with the great halls, but no central authority, no capital city, no grand vision of conquest. Instead, the power of these early raiders lay in their adaptability. They weren't conquering in the traditional sense. They were spreading like spores, setting down in rivers, trading posts and coastal inlets. They weren't there to govern. They were there to move, to seek, to shape the margins, and this is what the Ghost Fleet at Saaremaa shows us. Not just that the Viking Age began earlier than we thought, but that it never really had a beginning. It was a pattern, not a moment. A long, slow tide of ambition and violence that built not through declarations, but through burial, through war, through whispered names that never made it into the sagas. These men, whoever they were, did not survive to see the Viking world they helped create. But they were the first data points in a system that would stretch from Iceland to Baghdad. One of the archaeologists who worked the Saaremaa site said it best. It's like opening a door we didn't know existed, a door to a time when the lines were still being drawn. And maybe that's the real reason we study them, not just to reclassify a few centuries or update our maps, but to understand how stories start, not in glory, but in bone, not in chronicles, but in questions. Because every ghost ship is a riddle, every burial a clue, and somewhere just off the coast the wind is still blowing toward a shore that no longer remembers who came before. History likes clean beginnings, a date, a raid, a villain, the kind of event that can be underlined in textbooks and turned into a trivia question. When did the Viking Age begin? Most will answer with the year 793, the attack on Lindisfarne, that blood-soaked moment when longships hit Christian shores like thunder on glass. But like most historical milestones, this one isn't a beginning. It's a symptom, a flashpoint, a scream that followed centuries of quiet pressure. Because the truth is, the Viking Age didn't begin with violence. It began with scarcity, with politics, with trade routes collapsing, kingdoms rising, and a world slowly closing in on itself. The raids didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of necessity. Let's go back, not to the 8th century, but to the 6th. In the shadow of the so-called migration period, when Germanic tribes surged across a crumbling Roman frontier and the political order of Western Europe began to fracture into pieces, the North had its own problems. Climatic chaos struck the continent in what scientists now call the late antique Little Ice Age. Around the year 536, a massive volcanic eruption, likely in Central America or Iceland, filled the sky with ash, triggering one of the coldest decades in the last 2 millennia. Crops failed, famines spread, the sun dimmed, and in Scandinavia, where the growing season was already brief and precarious, the effect was catastrophic. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a collapse in population density across southern Norway and central Sweden. Entire farms were abandoned. Burial sites vanish from the record. In some places, it seems people simply left. And those who stayed, they adapted. New burial customs, new religious expressions, new survival strategies. By the 7th century, the climate had stabilised, but the scars remained in the land, in the culture, and in the stories passed down through oral tradition. Scandinavian mythology begins to form here around this time. A world-ending winter, a sun-eating wolf, the sense that fate is cruel and survival is a kind of sacred defiance. The seeds of Viking resilience weren't grown in victory, they were forged in catastrophe. Then came the silver. By the 8th century, the Islamic world was booming. Abbasid merchants minted silver dirhams by the millions, and trade routes stretched from the Caspian Sea to the coasts of the Baltic. And in a northern world that lacked precious metals of its own, silver wasn't just money, it was memory. It allowed for complex transactions, wealth storage, dowries, and prestige. Hoards of Abbasid silver have been found buried across Scandinavia, often hundreds of kilometres from the nearest trade hub. And while we tend to associate Vikings with stolen treasure, much of this early silver came not through raiding, but through commerce. Furs, walrus ivory, amber and slaves flowed south. In return came coins, jewellery and influence. But trade alone doesn't make an age. For that you need ambition. And sometime in the 8th century, something shifted in the structure of power back home. Scandinavia, once a patchwork of local clans and semi-nomadic farmers, began to consolidate. Small chieftains became regional kings, and regional kings, hungry for more control, began to impose laws, collect tribute, and enforce authority. In Norway, figures like Harald Fairhair would later claim to have united the land under a single rule. But such unifications were never clean. They meant suppression, resistance, and exile. Power does not consolidate peacefully. When kings rise, outlaws multiply. And for many young warriors, the choice was simple: serve a king or sail for silver. Many chose the latter. The structure of raiding culture began to take form, not in opposition to authority, but as an escape from it. Bands of men, often from the same clan or region, would organise under a jarl or sea king, pooling resources to build a ship, gather supplies, and set out during the warmer months for opportunity abroad. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they raided. Often they did both on the same trip, but they were not aimless. They were strategic. They targeted weak points, unguarded monasteries, borderlands in political turmoil. Their aim wasn't destruction, it was wealth, influence, leverage, and their timing was perfect. In the late 8th century, the Christian kingdoms of Western Europe were vulnerable. Charlemagne's empire was expanding, but his resources were stretched thin, his armies locked in long, brutal wars with Saxon pagans. In England, the so-called Heptarchy, 7 fragmented kingdoms lacked unity or coherent defence strategies. And in Ireland, a patchwork of monastic centres and tribal alliances left the coasts exposed. Viking raiders weren't striking at random. They were probing, learning, mapping the weaknesses of a fractured post-Roman world, and then Lindisfarne happened. On the 8th of June, in the year 793, a group of Scandinavian warriors landed on a tidal island off the northeast coast of England. There they attacked a monastery, sacred, isolated, and wealthy. They killed monks, smashed relics, took gold, silver, and captives. It was not the first raid, but it was the first to be recorded by Christian chroniclers with horror and precision. Alcuin of York wrote, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain. Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert spattered with the blood of the priests of God." And just like that, the Northmen had entered the written record. But let's be clear, the men who landed at Lindisfarne were not the beginning. They were the result of economic shifts, climatic pressures, political consolidation, and geographic knowledge passed down through generations. They didn't come from nowhere. They came from a world that had been changing quietly for centuries and had finally run out of patience. And the monasteries? They weren't just places of worship. They were storage vaults, literacy hubs, repositories of art, coinage, and memory. To the Vikings, they weren't attacking religion. They were attacking banks guarded by men who didn't fight back. The brutality was not ideological, it was economic, it was logistical, and it worked. Soon the raid spread. Iona, Jarrow, Paris, the coasts of Aquitaine and Frisia, the Rhines, the Seine, and every time a raid succeeded, it fed the machine. More silver, more ships, more stories to lure young men into the next summer's voyage. But again, this was not an empire. There were no edicts, no central planning, just an emergent pattern, evolving with each passing year. And so the question shifts, not why did the Viking Age begin, but why did it last? The answer lies in the adaptability of the system. Raiding was never the only option. When resistance stiffened, they traded. When kingdoms collapsed, they settled. When kings offered tribute, they accepted. The genius of the Viking Age wasn't just in the axe or the oar, it was in the refusal to be defined by one role. These were not just pirates. They were mercenaries, colonists, diplomats, and founders of cities. By the 9th century, entire families were migrating. Women, children, livestock. Not just warriors anymore, settlers. Dublin, York, Novgorod, and Reykjavik didn't appear overnight. They were the result of decades of strategic expansion, and behind them lay an invisible scaffolding, the knowledge that this system worked. That you could leave home, find land, and make a new life with or without the blessing of kings. So the Viking Age didn't start with a bang, it started with a shift. A long, slow drift from scattered clan loyalty towards something looser but more potent, a culture of calculated mobility, of violent opportunity, a culture built not on borders but on rivers and coasts. And the beauty of that system and the terror was that no one could predict where the next ship would land. The chronicles only give us half the story. They tell us of raids, bloodshed, terror, but they do not tell us why the monks had so much gold, or why the kings couldn't defend their coasts, or why, in the decades leading up to the first raid, the amount of foreign silver entering Scandinavia began to fall. The chronicles make the Vikings look like chaos, but chaos, in this case, had a very precise cause. The silver dried up, the kings got greedy, and the sons of the fjords, hemmed in by frozen soil and rising taxes, took to the sea, not for glory, but for survival. They weren't looking to become legends, they were looking to live. And in doing so, they changed the world. They called them sea serpents, not just because of the way they moved long and low, gliding through the mist with barely a wake, but because they seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. A monastery raided, a village set alight, a fortress left shaken and then nothing. No horses, no tents, no armies left to occupy the land, just wind, ash, and the creeping sense that something had slipped away before it could even be fought. To the people of Christian Europe, it felt like the apocalypse had found oars. But it wasn't prophecy, it was design. The real secret of the Vikings wasn't their gods or their rage, or even their bravery. It was the ship. And the ship, the thing that made the Viking world possible, didn't come from nowhere. By the early centuries of the first millennium, people in Scandinavia were already sailing. The coastal inlets of Norway, Sweden and Denmark had always demanded a certain kind of mobility. You couldn't survive there without understanding the sea. Fishing, trading, ferrying livestock, all of it required boats. And so from the Bronze Age onward, the peoples of the north became boat builders. Not just out of ambition, but out of necessity. They didn't start with warships, they started with survival, which is exactly why their designs became so good. The earliest prototypes were simple dugouts, long, hollowed-out logs used to navigate lakes and calm fjords. But by the 3rd and 4th centuries, Scandinavian shipwrights had begun experimenting with something more ambitious: overlapping planks. This method, later called clinker building, involved layering wooden boards like fish scales, each one fastened to the next using iron rivets and tree root lashings. The result was a hull that was both flexible and strong, a structure that could bend with the waves instead of cracking against them. This is no small detail. Most ships of the ancient world were stiff and deep. Roman galleys, Mediterranean merchant vessels, they were built to carry heavy loads and stay upright in choppy water, but they were not fast, and they were not subtle. Viking ships were the opposite. They were light, shallow, flexible. They didn't sit on the water so much as skim across it, like leaves in wind. And because of this, they could go where no other boats could follow. A Roman galley needed deep harbours. A Frankish barge required wide, slow rivers, but a Viking longship could land almost anywhere directly on the beach, up a narrow stream, or into the winding backwaters of a foreign estuary. The shallow draft, often less than a metre, meant they could navigate not only coasts but entire river systems. This is why they reached Paris, why they found the monasteries of Ireland, why they slipped into the wetlands of eastern England and the swamps of Byzantium and the reed-choked arteries of what is now Ukraine. The ship, not the sword, was their greatest weapon. It let them strike and then disappear. The design was elegant, but not simple. Building a longship required knowledge, materials and time. The hull was often carved from oak chosen for its strength and bend. The keel, the spine of the ship, was cut from a single straight log and shaped to form the foundation of the serpent-like curve. From there, planks were overlapped and nailed into place, each one heated and shaped using steam-bending techniques passed down through generations. Once the ribs were added and lashed to the hull, the ship began to take form, sleek, flexible, alive. And then came the oars. Most longships had between 20 and 30 pairs of oars, but some of the largest, like the fabled Drakkar, or dragon ships, had over 60. The oars were set in open ports, not enclosed holes, which allowed the crew to pull them in quickly if beaching was necessary. When wind was favourable, a single square sail, often made of wool and coated in animal fat, could be hoisted from the central mast. But in a pinch, the Vikings could row for hours or even days, slipping through fog banks and tidal flats in near silence. Steering was done with a single side-mounted rudder, called a steerboard, the origin, incidentally, of the word starboard. It was controlled by a helmsman, often chosen not just for strength, but for skill. Guiding a longship wasn't like captaining a modern vessel. It was an art to dance between current, wind and will, and the Vikings were master dancers. But the ship was more than just a tool. It was a world view. Viking mythology is full of ships, magical ones, world-spanning ones, even ships made from the nails of the dead. The most famous, Nugvar, was said to carry giants to battle at Ragnarok, the final end of days. To the Norse mind, a ship was not just a means of transport. It was a bridge between worlds, between land and sea, life and death. Known and the unknown. This is why they were buried in them. The ship burials of Scandinavia, like those found in Gokstad and Oseberg, are not war memorials. They are cosmological statements. When a chieftain died, his followers built a boat, loaded it with goods, and placed the body inside, surrounded by weapons, animals, sometimes even servants. Then they covered the whole thing with earth, creating a kind of frozen voyage to the afterlife. In some cases, the ships were burned first, sent flaming into the night. But the message was the same. Death is a journey, and the ship is the only way across. And so, from birth to battle to burial, the ship was central to Viking life. It made their raids possible, their trade routes viable, their mythology tangible. And yet, perhaps most strangely of all, it didn't come from conquest. It came from craftsmanship, from centuries of tinkering and observing and reworking a design until it fit not just the sea, but the human soul. This is what made them dangerous. When the Vikings attacked Lindisfarne in the year 793, they didn't just hit a target, they proved a concept, that with the right vessel, even a small band of men could punch far above their weight. They didn't need legions, they didn't need supply lines, they needed wind, water and wood. And in a world dominated by slow communication and regional kings, that was enough to redraw the map. But the most terrifying thing to their enemies was not the raid, it was the retreat. The Vikings didn't hold territory at first, they didn't build forts or claim provinces. They came, they took, and they left. They moved with a kind of liquidity that made resistance almost impossible. By the time a response was mustered, the ships were already gone, sails dim on the horizon, hulls hugging the waves. In a world of stone castles and plodding cavalry, this was like fighting smoke with a sword. And so the ship became a symbol of everything the Vikings were. Fast, flexible, precise. A snake in the grass, a phantom on the tide. Today, we've recovered several of these vessels from burial mounds, riverbeds and museum reconstructions. The most famous, the Gokstad ship, dates to the late 9th century and measures over 75 feet long. Its hull curves like a bow, its planks still joined by iron rivets hand-hammered more than 1,000 years ago. When tested in modern waters, it was seaworthy. Fast, quiet, capable of travelling hundreds of miles without the need for deep ports or harbours. 1,000 years later, the design still works. But perhaps the strangest thing about these ships is how few of them remain. For every Gokstad there are dozens, maybe hundreds, that have vanished. Sunk in fjords, burned in rituals, left to rot on forgotten shores. The Vikings did not build monuments. They built vehicles. And when those vehicles were done serving their purpose, they were left to the sea. It was not about legacy. It was about motion. The ship was never meant to last. It was meant to move. And move they did. Across the North Sea, into the Irish rivers, through the Frankish heartlands, down the Volga, across the Black Sea, into the Caspian, and eventually all the way to Constantinople and beyond. Some even reached North America, not because they had better maps or divine guidance, or overwhelming numbers, but because their ships could take them there, and their minds were already prepared to leave. So the next time someone asks how the Vikings appeared out of nowhere, remember this: they didn't appear, they arrived, because they had built the tools centuries before the world noticed to go wherever the water whispered, and when the wind turned, they were already gone. There are places on Earth that teach you something just by forcing you to live there. The fjords of Norway are like that. They are not gentle valleys or open plains. They are deep, flooded scars in the landscape, carved by ice and filled with cold salt water. The mountains do not roll, they rise. The sky does not shelter, it looms. The sea is not a border, it is the only road. And if you are born here not into a city or a port, but into a narrow, winding village squeezed between cliff and wave, then you do not learn the world as a child crawling across flat floors. You learn it by looking up and by drifting out. It is here, in these claustrophobic fjordlands, that we begin to understand how the Vikings raised their young. Not as citizens, not as peasants, but as embryonic explorers. From the very start, even in infancy, the physical world taught them that the land was not their ally. It was the sea that gave them motion, and the boat not the house that gave them shelter, and sometimes, quite literally, the cradle. Archaeologists have uncovered multiple examples of Viking-era infant graves where the child is laid to rest not in a coffin or earthen pit, but in a tiny boat-shaped vessel, sometimes an actual miniature boat, other times a symbolic carving shaped like a hull. One particularly haunting grave, discovered in the island of Gotska Sandön in the Baltic Sea, revealed the remains of a young child no older than 3, laid gently inside a small clinker-built vessel lined with wool. Around the edges were iron rivets, the same kind used in full-size longships. At the child's feet a carved toy axe, at the head a whalebone comb. This was not a burial designed for sorrow. It was a ritual of belonging. The boat was not a metaphor. It was an inheritance. Why raise children in a culture so shaped by ships? The answer is not simply geographic. Though the Scandinavian landscape made land travel nearly impossible for most of the year, it's more than practicality. It's something deeper, a kind of cognitive programming. To be born into a boat-shaped world is to accept the sea as your baseline reality. It erases the fear of open water before fear even forms. The boat is not an escape pod. It is the crib, the classroom, the altar, and it teaches motion before safety. Even the language of the Norse sagas reflects this early conditioning. In Old Norse, the word for a journey furred is not landlocked. It implies movement across or away, often by water. The word for destiny at Örlög literally means beyond law, as if fate itself were something that came from outside, riding in with the tide. To be raised in such a place was to internalize drift, to live in a constant simulation of departure, and the simulation was everywhere. Viking childhood was not soft. In fact, it was barely distinguishable from training. Children were expected to mimic adult roles from as early as age 4 or 5. Little boys carved wooden swords and practiced throwing stones across fjords. They watched their fathers lash sails, gut fish, sharpen blades. They learned weather the way modern children learn cartoons as ambient background noise that quickly becomes part of your internal logic, and they played in the boats, not beside them, in them. On the shores of Roskilde Fjord in Denmark, one preserved Viking ship museum houses a replica longship often visited by school groups. One anthropologist observed that the children, even in the modern era, showed no hesitation when climbing aboard. The layout of the vessel, with its rib-like benches and open planking, felt strangely intuitive to them, as if somewhere in the collective Scandinavian memory, boat architecture had become a kind of second womb. But back then, it wasn't just memory, it was life, and sometimes death. There are rune stones, those upright slabs of carved memory that the Vikings left behind, which speak not only of adult warriors lost in raids or drowned at sea, but of young boys who never made landfall or died with the fleet. This was not sentimentality, it was documentation. These boys were not considered too young to matter. They were already part of the system. In some coastal communities, it's believed that boys as young as 10 would be taken aboard merchant ships as assistants, messengers or oarsmen. They were not hostages to adult ambition. They were participants. They had quite literally been born for this. And this early exposure to motion, death and risk did something strange to the Viking psyche. It produced a people who were not only unafraid of the unknown, they were magnetized by it. A people who, generation after generation, chose not expansion by empire, but diffusion by infiltration. They didn't march, they drifted. And unlike other conquest-based cultures, they rarely forced the sea to conform to them. Instead, they built themselves, their muscles, their boats, their families to conform to the sea. Even their myths reflect this identity. Consider the god Njord, the Norse deity of the sea and winds. Unlike Poseidon, who rules with a trident and rage, Njord is a gentler, more transactional figure. He brings wealth through sailing. His children Freyr and Freya are gods of fertility and prosperity, not war. The sea in Norse cosmology is not a chaos to be tamed. It is a network to be navigated, a god to be bargained with. And to make such bargains, you must be prepared, from birth. There is something deeply modern, almost eerily familiar, about the Viking strategy of simulation as socialization. It's a kind of psychological immersion therapy exposing children to just enough risk, motion and symbolic death that real departure becomes a continuation, not a rupture. In this way, Viking society engineered not soldiers, but voyagers, not patriots, but pathfinders. And so, from the very first swaddle, Viking children were embedded in vessels, literal and metaphorical, that trained their bodies and brains to equate distance with opportunity, not fear. A cradle shaped like a boat is not just a coffin in reverse, it is a story, a programming, a message to the newborn. This world is made of movement, and your life will be shaped by water. It's no coincidence, then, that so many Viking settlements were not centralized capitals, but literal outposts: Reykjavik, York, Novgorod, Dublin, all places where the sea could reach inland, where the boat could slip through the cracks of an empire. These weren't accidents of topography, they were strategic repetitions of childhood geography, little fjords in foreign lands, memory mirrored across the map. So what does it mean to raise a child in a cradle of conquest? To raise him not to dominate a land, but to disappear into its edges? It means that conquest was never the point. Survival was, adaptability, motion. The boat-shaped crib isn't a symbol of violence. It's a symbol of fluidity, a body that will never fully settle into any place, but will always know how to find one. And maybe, in a world like ours, still obsessed with flags and borders, that's the real secret of the Vikings. They didn't build nations, they didn't plant roots, they learned how to float. And they passed that lesson down one plank at a time from the first breath to the last voyage. In the end, the child in the boat is not a curiosity. He is a code. He is the entire system quietly repeating itself. And long after the saga's end, long after the last rune is carved, it is his shape curved like a hull, pointed like a prow that slips into the future, unnoticed but unforgettable. If you were to climb aboard a Viking ship in the middle of the North Atlantic sometime in the 9th century, you would not find a map. There would be no compass, no inked parchment tucked into the folds of a waterproof pouch, no star chart rolled tight beside the oars. There would be no instruments at all, no sextants, no telescopes, no devices for measuring wind or time or speed, and yet somehow they knew exactly where they were going. The Vikings had no need for maps, because they became the maps. Their minds were the charts, their stories were the coordinates, and the world they sailed through was not measured in miles but in memories. This is the story of how the Vikings navigated the unknown, not with tools but with attention. The ocean is not a uniform thing. Even before modern navigation, people who lived on the sea learned to read its moods like a language. A certain swell meant a certain depth. A certain colour meant sand versus stone. The direction of the waves could tell you whether you were near land or trapped in the open deep. Viking sailors were trained from childhood to interpret these signs, and not just the sky as well. One of the most extraordinary discoveries in recent years comes not from a Viking burial or a hoard of treasure, but from a shipwrecked sunstone. Found in a 16th century English warship but believed to be of much older origin, this crystal, a piece of Iceland spar, may hold the key to the Viking GPS. The idea is this: even on cloudy days, sunlight is polarized as it passes through Earth's atmosphere. This creates bands of invisible light orientation that some animals, like bees and birds, can see. Vikings, it turns out, may have used sunstones to detect this polarized light and locate the sun's position even in dense fog. By rotating the crystal until a certain glow aligned, they could fix their heading with surprising accuracy, no sun required. If this theory is correct, then the Vikings had something astonishing: a way to find solar direction in bad weather, long before the compass ever reached European hands. But the sunstone alone didn't guide them. It was just one piece of a multi-sensory system. Another vital method was something far more ancient: dead reckoning. A sailor would count their strokes, watch the timing of the waves, observe the drift of the ship's wake. They would note the angle of the wind on their cheek, the hiss of the bow, the scent of distant land carried on sea air. Navigation was not abstract, it was embodied. The body itself became the compass tuned through years of practice and layered memory. And yet, all of this would have meant nothing without something more enduring: the oral map. The Vikings, as far as we know, never wrote down sea charts. Their sagas, which were not written until centuries later, recorded adventures and myth, but not latitudes or nautical bearings. So how did they transmit navigational knowledge across generations? They told stories. In these stories, islands had names. Landmarks were described not by distance but by experience. The time it took to cross a stretch of water was measured in meals, in verses sung, in the behaviour of birds. Sail 2 days past the whale bones, where the sky begins to dance, and you'll find the land of green cliffs. That was a direction, not a joke. On the voyage to Iceland, for example, sailors would release ravens. If the raven circled and returned, land was far. If it flew straight in one direction and did not return, that was your heading. These birds, raised and trained for the task, were more than animals. They were instruments. They formed part of a living, breathing, flapping map. And so did the sea. Modern scientists have begun mapping the fine-scale currents of the North Atlantic, and what they found confirms what the Vikings already knew in their bones. Certain underwater rivers barely perceptible to the eye can carry a ship hundreds of miles if you ride their flow just right. These are not metaphorical paths. They are real, physical corridors of moving water, created by temperature shifts, wind direction, and the shape of the ocean floor. Viking sailors didn't need to know the physics, they could feel the pull, and when they reached land, they remembered. There is evidence that Viking captains kept oral logs, long, memorized poems or phrases that encoded their route. Some historians call these sea lays. They may have gone something like this. To the west of the Wolf's Tongue lies the Silver Bay. When the stars of winter tilt and the salt wind dries the eye, steer north to the Stone's Edge. It sounds like poetry, but it's also navigation, myth and map wrapped in one. These sea lays were passed on like sacred lore, sung, chanted, whispered by firelight, practiced during winter, taught to children. To be a navigator was to be a bard, a memory keeper, a cartographer of breath. And it wasn't only islands they remembered, it was illusions too. The Viking mind was comfortable with mystery. They believed in lands that shifted shape, in islands that appeared and vanished, in sea monsters that marked the edges of maps not because they existed, but because they told you when to turn around. One of the most famous of these phantomed places was Vitramannaland, White Men's Land, a rumoured coast far to the west where pale-skinned people lived in wooden cities. Some versions of the saga place it past Greenland, others suggest it was Vinland. Still others say it never existed at all. But that didn't stop the Vikings from believing, or sailing in its direction. Because even a rumour, repeated enough times, becomes a kind of map. It teaches you where to go, or where to look, or what to expect. And sometimes it even turns out to be true. After all, the Vikings reached North America nearly 500 years before Columbus, and they did it without a single written instruction. Just a combination of ravens, memory, sunstones, and the aching desire to know what came next. This desire, more than any tool, is what powered the Viking GPS. It was not accuracy that mattered most. It was continuity. The knowledge had to last. It had to survive bad weather, missing fathers, generations between voyages. And so it became ritual, pattern, story, etched not in stone but in children's minds. And if you think that sounds unreliable, consider this. Modern Polynesian sailors with no instruments whatsoever regularly cross thousands of miles using similar oral techniques. They use star maps encoded in chants. They memorize the shape of the waves against their canoe. They read the clouds, the birds, the smell of coral reefs under the surface. These aren't guesses, they are system. The Vikings had their own version of these star maps. Though little remains of the original constellations used, there are references to star paths and night sings, phrases, used to describe the slow turning of the sky and how it aligned with known points on the sea. One tale tells of a sailor who knew when to turn west only when the Bear Star's tail dipped below the horizon, while the sea still shimmered with ghostlight. This was their midnight clock, the kind you learn not from books, but from watching the same sky your father watched. And so we return to the myth of Viking chaos, the idea that they stumbled around Europe like drunken barbarians, landing wherever the wind took them. This could not be more wrong. The truth is, they were among the most capable navigators of their time, not because they invented new tools, but because they refined an ancient one, the human mind. Their GPS was not carved in brass or etched in paper, it was spoken, sung, and lived. And in that sense, the Viking map was more alive than any parchment scroll. It did not just tell you where you were, it told you how to be, how to listen, how to move, and most of all, how to remember, because to cross an ocean with no compass is not madness, it is mastery. And the world they charted one rumour at a time still shimmers beneath our modern maps, waiting to be remembered. There were no customs checkpoints, no stamped papers, no iron borders on the Viking trade routes. There were no fixed maps or published ledgers, no centralised oversight and no written contracts. And yet, from the icy waters of the Baltic to the blistering cities of Mesopotamia, something moved. Something real, something measurable. A web. It carried silver, silk and amber. It carried swords, runes and memories. And it carried human beings bought, sold, forgotten. The Viking world was not just a world of warriors. It was a world of trade. And the most extraordinary thing about their economic empire is that they never called it one. In the 8th and 9th centuries, while Charlemagne's scribes were documenting laws and church fathers were debating sin and salvation, the Norse were moving goods with no written language, no coin of the realm, and no permanent capital city. Their economy didn't spread outward from a throne. It rippled like wind across water. It moved through mouths, myths, and market days. And sometimes it moved through violence. The town of Birka, in what is now Sweden, may have had a population of only a few hundred at its peak. But in the 9th century it was one of the most important trade hubs in all of northern Europe. Archaeologists digging at Birka have found beads from the Islamic world, scales for weighing silver, and even coins bearing the name of Abbasid caliphs, and none of this is an accident. It is the fingerprint of a vast, undocumented trade system, Viking in name, but global in scope. Here's what we now believe. The Norse didn't just raid and pillage, they exported furs, walrus ivory, amber and slaves. In return they imported silver, silk, glassware and spices. But this wasn't some orderly supply chain managed by bureaucrats. It was fluid, shifting, often bloody. And it relied on something more primal than contracts. It relied on reputation. To do business across thousands of kilometres without shared language or centralised law, you had to be memorable. If you cheated someone, word got around. If you protected your traders and paid your debts, the stories followed you. And in a world where every deal depended on trust, stories became currency. The Volga River was a kind of silver superhighway. It flowed south through what is now Russia, connecting Viking settlements like Staraya Ladoga and Novgorod with the Islamic trading centres near the Caspian Sea. Along this route, Arab silver coins known as dirhams poured into the Norse economy. These coins have been found in Viking hoards as far west as Ireland and as far north as the Arctic Circle. In fact, more Abbasid silver has been found in Sweden than in many parts of the Islamic world itself. But the dirham wasn't just money, it was transformation. Silver became the standard by which Viking wealth was measured not in minted value, but by weight. In Viking society, silver was cut into pieces, bent, tested by bite, and weighed on portable scales. A coin was not worth what it said, it was worth what it weighed. And so the economy became tactile, personal, almost sensual. And yet silver wasn't the only thing the Vikings moved. They also moved people. It is an uncomfortable truth that the Viking trade routes were also slave routes. Known as thralls, these captives were taken during raids or bought at markets. They were women, children and men sometimes taken from Christian monasteries, sometimes from Slavic villages. Some were kept, others were sold to Byzantine officials, Arab merchants or wealthy Norse farmers. At Hedeby, another major trading town near the Danish-German border, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of large-scale human commerce. Pens for holding slaves, chains and collars, and inscriptions on runestones that mention gifts of people. One woman's grave, found near a Viking elite burial, shows signs of being strangled, likely as part of a ritual or funerary custom. In this network, human lives were not sacred, they were units of value, exchangeable, disposable. But even this human trafficking had a structure. Just as Viking trade in goods relied on oral reputation, the slave economy relied on demand, and the greatest demand came from the Islamic caliphates. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the Abbasid world was booming. Cities like Baghdad were centres of wealth and learning, filled with philosophers, mathematicians and artisans. But their economy, like all great empires, needed labour. And so Slavic slaves, transported by Viking intermediaries, became a vital part of the system. The very word slave in many languages comes from Slav. The Vikings didn't just connect these empires, They lubricated them. They served as the invisible mesh between Christian kings in the west and Muslim emirs in the east, between tribal chieftains in the north and silk merchants in the south. They were not just pirates, they were globalizers. And yet, unlike the empires they traded with, they built no cities of marble, issued no decrees, left no libraries. Their trade routes left behind no maps, only hoards, buried caches of silver, arm rings, hacked up coins and weighing scales found in peat bogs, under farmhouses and in forgotten fields, each one a frozen moment of economic motion, a whisper from the network. Some of these hoards are astonishing in scale. The Spillings hoard, discovered in the 1990s on the island of Gotland, contained more than 60,000 silver coins, the largest Viking silver find ever unearthed. Among them were dirhams from Samarkand, Persian coins from the Samanid dynasty, and a smattering of Frankish currency. It is a testament to just how far the Viking web stretched and how wealthy some of its nodes became. But this wealth came at a cost. Along with silver and silk, the Viking routes also carried disease. In the mid-9th century, plague outbreaks devastated parts of Europe. Some historians now believe that Viking trade may have helped reintroduce the Black Death to northern regions. Their ships, moving swiftly between ports, were perfect vectors. Rats and fleas needed no passports. And in a world where science was myth and quarantine was heresy, sickness moved like shadow. Memory too travelled along these routes. The Norse sagas, recorded centuries after the Viking Age ended, contain whispers of distant cities and strange peoples. There are references to Sirkland, a name given to the lands of the Saracens. There are tales of rivers so wide you cannot see the other bank, of cities where the roofs shine like water and the people bow to Mecca. These are not just fables, they are traces of real contact, half-remembered impressions of real journeys. Even the gods moved. As Viking traders returned from the east, they brought back not only goods but ideas. Some scholars believe that the Norse myth of Odin, the god who hangs himself to gain wisdom, may have been influenced by the contact with Sufi mysticism. The idea of sacrifice for enlightenment, of vision through suffering, has echoes across cultures. It is not proof, but it is possibility. And then there were the returns that never happened. Many Viking expeditions ended in death or disappearance. Ships lost to storms, caravans swallowed by the riverbanks, traders who never came back. And yet the routes remained. Because they weren't routes in the modern sense, they were flows, and like all flows, they depended on rhythm, not permanence. In the year 1011, the Persian traveller Ahmed ibn Fadlan recorded his encounter with the Rus, a group of Scandinavian traders and warriors he met along the Volga. He describes them in vivid, even though horrified terms: tall, tattooed, obsessed with cleanliness, brutal in their treatment of slaves, and elaborate in their funerals. But he also describes their reverence, their devotion to ritual, their pride. These were not random marauders. They were cultural emissaries, terrifying, yes, but coherent. What Ahmad ibn Fadlan saw was not an outpost. It was a node in a system. A Viking embedded in a Muslim world, trading goods, telling stories, counting silver. The trade route no one drew, but everyone used. The real miracle of the Viking economy is not that it existed. It's that it endured. Without bureaucracy, without state control, without permanent cities, it lasted for centuries. Because it wasn't built on paper, it was built on memory, on trust, on the terrifying intimacy of human exchange. And when the Viking Age ended, when the raids ceased, and the silver dried up and the Christian kingdoms swallowed the north, the maps were finally drawn. But by then the web was already gone. What was once whispered from mouth to mouth became frozen on parchment. What was once felt was now filed. And we forgot. We forgot that northern Europe was once wired into the heart of the Muslim world. That Swedish farmers once paid for their land with coins minted in Baghdad. That long before the Silk Road became a cliché, the Silver River ran north, and carried with it not just wealth, but stories. Not everything leaves a mark, but trade the quiet kind, the kind that happens without monuments or medals, reshapes the world. It draws lines we can't see until centuries later, and by then it's too late to remember who drew them, unless of course you dig, and that's what archaeology is, the reverse engineering of rumour, the cartography of forgotten contact, the slow unearthing of maps no one wrote down but everyone followed. And somewhere in the cold earth of Gotland or under the river mud of Ladoga, there is still a trader's scale, Still a coin passed from hand to hand across 1,000 miles. Still the silent proof of a world that was once connected, not by empires, but by exchange. A map without ink, a network without wires, a truth without borders. There are cities that emerge from farmland, cities that grow from crossroads, and cities that rise where a king says they should. And then there are cities like Dublin, cities not born but bitten into existence, cities dragged from the sea by men whose empire had no borders, no flags and no name, a city that was less of a settlement and more of a wound, an ulcer opened in the flesh of Ireland by something that came slithering out of the North Sea, a sea monster made of wood, iron and muscle. This is the story of how Dublin, the capital of Ireland, the heart of a nation, was built by Vikings, and not by accident, but by design. In the year 841, a fleet of Norwegian longships sailed up the mouth of the River Liffey. The river bent and forked into a natural harbour, a dark pool of brackish water where the tides met the current. In Old Norse, they named it Dyflin, the Black Pool. This was not the first time the Norse had come to Ireland. They had raided the monasteries of Armagh and Bangor, burned Lindisfarne off the English coast, and struck deep into Pictland and Northumbria. But this time was different. They were not here to grab gold and go home. They were here to stay. The timing was perfect, if perfect means apocalyptic. Ireland was fractured. Dozens of petty kings and warlords squabbled for dominance. The so-called High Kings had no real power outside their home regions. Monasteries controlled enormous wealth, but had no armies. And the island, while rich in gold, cattle and craftsmanship, had almost no urban centres. The Irish were a rural people, organised around kinship, clan and sacred sites, not cities. The Vikings saw the gap, and they filled it. At Dublin, the Norse established something entirely new, a permanent long fort. The word means a ship fort, a base designed not just for raiding, but for overwintering, repairing vessels, and gathering loot for long-term campaigns. They dragged their ships onto the banks, threw up palisades of sharpened timber, and built storehouses, workshops, and pens not for animals, but for people. Human cargo. Because Dublin was, first and foremost, a slave city. At its peak, Dublin became the largest slave market in Western Europe. Irish captives were taken in raids, men, women, children, and sold to Norse merchants, who ferried them to buyers as far away as the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and the courts of the Byzantine Empire. Others were sold back to rival Irish clans. The Vikings were equal opportunity opportunists. This was not incidental to the city's function. It was the city's function. Unlike Roman towns built on civic pride and public works, or Frankish towns anchored by cathedrals and castles, Dublin was an organism for the extraction and redistribution of human life. Silver flowed in, bodies flowed out, but the monster was more than teeth. Alongside the trade in flesh came goods walrus ivory from Greenland, silk from Byzantium, wine from Francia, glass beads from North Africa. Arabic dirhams, silver coins stamped with Kufic script poured into Dublin in astonishing numbers. To this day, metal detectorists still pull Abbasid silver from Irish soil. The North Sea was not a barrier. It was a highway, and Dublin was its toll booth. And yet the violence that built Dublin also made it something strange, something the Vikings never quite built anywhere else, a city. By the late 9th century, Dublin was no longer just a long fort. It had street grids, permanent buildings, a mixed population of Norse, Irish, and Hiberno-Scandinavian families. It had a market square, a shipyard, even a form of municipal governance, not a king in the traditional sense, but a warlord merchant oligarchy that set taxes, settled disputes and regulated trade. And it worked, too well. Because what the Vikings accidentally invented in Dublin was not a colony and not an empire, but a kind of multicultural parasite, a place where no one fully belonged, where Irish slaves, Norse traders, Arab silver dealers, and Pictish mercenaries all crossed paths, none of them fully in charge, none of them fully safe. It was a city that fed on the divisions around it, offering both opportunity and annihilation. And the Irish kings hated it. But they also needed it. For the fragmented clans of Ireland, Dublin became a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a nest of vipers, a foreign outpost, a slave hub, a pagan scar on Christian land. On the other hand, it was a place to sell surplus cattle, buy exotic goods, hire Viking mercenaries, and even ransom captured kin. Some Irish kings allied with Dublin's Norse rulers. Others tried to destroy them, most did both, depending on the year. The line between Viking and Irish blurred. Some Norse warlords married into Irish noble families. Some Irish chiefs converted to Norse ways, adopting shipbuilding, longhouses, and even Norse weaponry. By the mid-10th century, Dublin was ruled by the descendants of both men with Irish mothers and Norse fathers, or vice versa. Neither fully Viking nor fully Irish, both and neither. But the sea monster had a flaw. Its stomach was bottomless. By the late 10th century, the very forces that built Dublin began to turn against it. The supply of easy slaves dried up. Irish resistance grew more coordinated, and the economic engine of the Viking world, the Abbasid silver trade, began to collapse as Middle Eastern markets destabilized. Without fresh silver, Dublin's economy staggered. Without endless wars to feed it, the slave markets shrank, and the Irish struck. In the year 980, Mael Secnail Mac Domnail, the High King of Meath, attacked Dublin, burned its walls, and slaughtered its defenders. It was not the first time the Irish had assaulted the city, but it was the first time they broke it. The Norse rebuilt. They always rebuilt. But the golden age of Viking Dublin was over. It lingered, as a shadow, as a scar, as a port where Irish and Norse bloodlines tangled and merged. But the monster had eaten itself. Its hunger had outrun its prey. And yet, the bones remained. The modern city of Dublin sits atop the Viking grid. Its street patterns trace the outlines of long-forgotten timber walls. Archaeological digs under parking garages still turn up ship nails, amber beads, slave shackles, and dirhams which are all stamped with the name of caliphs who never heard the word Ireland. The story of Dublin is not a story of foreign invasion versus native resistance. It is a story of what happens when commerce, violence, and geography fuse into something neither side fully controls. A monster made of trade, a city born of plunder, a multicultural experiment that was never meant to last but never fully died. And like all sea monsters, it left a mark, not just in the mud, not just in the bones, but in the DNA of the island, in the surnames, in the city walls, in the half-forgotten words that slipped into Irish from Old Norse lag for law, Margad for market, Pingin for penny. Dublin is a memory pretending to be a city, a shadow of a long fort pretending to be a capital, a sea monster that learned how to walk on land. And in a way, it never really let go of the ocean. Even today, the River Liffey still rises and falls with the tide, still pulls brackish water in from the bay, still remembers, in the whisper of its current, the day the longships arrived and the day the world shifted. It always starts with the soil. It doesn't matter if the grave is shallow or deep, if the bodies were laid down with care or dumped like garbage. The ground holds the memory. It holds the weight of what happened. And in the small English village of Repton, just beyond the shadow of the ancient churchyard, the soil has been whispering for more than 1,000 years. To walk through Repton today is to see the typical signs of an English countryside parish: narrow roads, leaning gravestones, the smell of wet moss. But underneath that tranquility, buried beneath layers of frost and mud, lies something else. Something raw, something human, a mass grave, a Viking mass grave. In the winter of 873, the so-called Great Heathen Army, a coalition of Viking warbands led by legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba, made Repton their winter camp. This was no passing raid. This was a military occupation, a launching point for conquest. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia was fractured, its armies beaten, its people terrified. And the Vikings did what they always did when given time. They dug in. For archaeologists, the first clue came in the 1970s. Excavations near St. Winston's Church revealed a pit, or more precisely, a trench filled with human remains. The bones were packed tightly, limbs jumbled, skulls cracked. There was no neat row of burials, no Christian alignment facing east, just a tangle of bodies, stacked together like firewood. More than 260 men, almost all of them young, almost all of them showing signs of violent death. But this was not a battlefield grave. It was too organised for that, too deliberate. Forensic analysis told the next part of the story. The bones belonged overwhelmingly to males between the ages of 16 and 45, prime fighting age. Many bore healed injuries from past battles, broken ribs that had mended, Fractures along the forearms from blade strikes, cuts to the skulls that showed signs of old scarring. These were not farmers caught in a massacre. These were warriors, hardened, experienced, but their final wounds told a different story. Some had been hacked apart, dismembered at the joints. Others showed perimortem trauma injuries sustained at the exact moment of death, blade marks slicing through neck vertebrae, punctures through eye sockets, crushing blows to the skull. A few had deep chest wounds that suggested execution by stabbing. One skeleton, found near the centre, had been buried with particular care, laid out on a bed of stones, accompanied by the remains of a large boar split and laid at his feet. For a long time this central burial puzzled researchers. Why single out one man? Why the boar? And why here, at the centre of a mass grave? Radiocarbon dating pushed the timeline squarely into the late 9th century, exactly the period when the Great Heathen Army was known to have wintered at Repton. Isotope analysis of the teeth showed Scandinavian signatures evidence that most of the dead had grown up in regions like Denmark, Sweden and Norway. But still the mystery of the central figure remained. One theory, popular among scholars and Viking enthusiasts alike, is that this could be the grave of Ivar the Boneless himself. The saga literature tells us Ivar died around this time, after years of campaigning in England. The boar in Norse mythology was a symbol of fertility, war, and royal power associated with Freyr and other gods. Bearing a war leader atop a mound of his dead warriors, with a sacred animal at his feet, would fit the grim poetry of Viking ritual. But without DNA, it's speculation. What we do know is this: the burial was symbolic, deliberate, not an accident. And then there are the others, the hundreds of others. Some lay face down, others with their arms severed or their legs hacked away. The trauma wasn't uniform. Some had been killed cleanly. Others had been tortured, beaten before death, stabbed repeatedly, strangled. One man had his spine split in two at the pelvis, a blow from below, driving upward, the kind of wound inflicted during execution or post-mortem mutilation. And it wasn't just the human remains that told a story. Mixed into the grave fill were fragments of animal bones, shards of pottery and broken weapons, some iron nails, pieces of leather, even small gaming pieces likely from the Viking board game Hnefatafl, scattered like forgotten dice across the bones. These weren't grave goods in the traditional sense. They were debris, leftovers from life or perhaps from ritual. One theory holds that after their leader died, the Great Heathen Army held a funeral for the ages, a mass cremation and burial of both the dead and their war trophies. Another theory suggests something darker, that many of the men in this grave were executed captives, enemy soldiers, local defenders, or even rebellious members of the Viking force punished for disobedience. The truth is, it may be both. Viking burial customs were never monolithic. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavia shows a range of practices from ship burials with rich grave goods to shallow pits with burned bones and little ceremony. In death, as in life, status mattered. Some were honoured, others discarded. At Repton, that division is written in the bones. Beyond the mass grave, isolated burials were found. Individual Viking warriors, laid out carefully, some with weapons, others with jewellery or foreign coins placed in their mouths, a tradition believed to pay for safe passage to the afterlife. These were likely officers, nobles, or men of particular renown. Their graves suggest respect, memory, ritual care. In stark contrast, the mass grave is a study in anonymity. There are no name markers, no carved stones, no runic inscriptions, just bones upon bones. The war machine had moved on, the dead stayed behind, and they stayed silent for more than 1,000 years, until the soil spoke. Modern forensic science has turned the ground at Repton into a textbook of Viking violence. Through stable isotope analysis, we know what these men ate: a high-protein diet rich in marine resources, typical of Norse warriors used to sea raids and long-distance travel. Through dental enamel studies, we know they spent their childhoods near cold northern waters. Through cut marks and bone fractures, we know how they fought and how they died. And yet the most haunting thing the skeletons tell us is what they don't say. Why were some men buried like kings and others like cattle? Why were game pieces tossed among the ribs? Why did no one come back to claim the bones? Was this a funeral? A punishment? A practical solution to battlefield logistics? The archaeology suggests that when the Vikings left Repton in the spring of 874, they did so in haste. They moved north toward York, toward new targets. The grave was left behind, sealed but unmarked, like a bad memory shoved into the back of the mind. But bad memories don't stay buried forever. In the modern village of Repton, local school children still play soccer over the ancient soil. Their feet trample the ground where 260 men lie tangled in death, and beneath every blade of grass the bones still whisper. They whisper of war and winter, of hunger and honour, of boys from Denmark who sailed across the sea to die in a field in England, of leaders who were buried with ceremony, and men who were tossed into a pit like refuse. They whisper that history is not written only by kings and scribes. It is written in the cartilage of the neck, snapped under blade, in the metacarpals of a hand raised too late to block a sword, in the shattered ribs of a man who thought he had more time, and sometimes, when the soil shifts and the frost recedes, they whisper loud enough for us to hear. Repton was not a battle. It was an aftermath, a consequence, a chapter in a longer story that the Vikings told in muscle, bone and blood. And now, more than 1,000 years later, the ground is still telling it. The problem with hiring a Viking is that they rarely stay hired, and the problem with paying them to leave is that they always come back. This is the lesson that Frankish kings learned too late when a man named Rollo stepped off a ship, sword in hand, and rewrote the future of Europe. Rollo did not have royal blood. He was not the son of a king or the heir to a throne. He was a raider, a pirate, a sea wolf born into the cold edge of Norway sometime in the late 9th century. His real name may have been Hrolfr, or Gongu Hrolfr, Rolf the Walker, not because he was a pilgrim, but because he was too big to ride a horse. A man so physically massive that even the Norse breeds of the time could not carry him, and so he walked, from the fjords of Norway to the rivers of Francia. It is impossible to pin down exactly when Rollo crossed from pirate to politician. The sagas tell conflicting stories. Some say he was exiled from Norway for raiding his own people. Others say he fled after a failed feud or political dispute. Still others claim he simply followed the silver, like so many did from the stormy North Sea, into the soft, tempting underbelly of the Frankish Empire. What we do know is this. By the early 10th century, the Frankish kings were desperate. Charlemagne's once mighty empire had shattered. His heirs' men, like Charles the Simple, were fighting each other for scraps of territory. And the coasts of France were wide open. Viking fleets sailed up the Seine, the Loire, the Garonne. They attacked Paris, burned Rouen, plundered monasteries and forced entire towns to buy their own survival. The solution, as the Franks saw it, was simple. If you cannot beat the Vikings, hire them, pay them to go away. Or better yet, give them a job, turn raiders into border guards, poachers into gamekeepers. And Rollo, towering, ruthless, pragmatic, was the perfect candidate. In the year 911, Charles the Simple offered Rollo a deal. The Viking would be granted land, a strip of northern France centred on the city of Rouen, in exchange for loyalty. Rollo would convert to Christianity, defend the coast from other raiders, swear fealty to the Frankish crown. In return, the land would be his, forever, heritable, legal. It was in many ways the first formal Viking land grant on the continent, and it terrified everyone. But even this bizarre negotiation was not without friction. When the terms were presented, Frankish custom required Rollo to kneel before the king and kiss his foot, a sign of vassalage, of submission. Rollo refused, flat out. The saga tells it plainly. I will never bow my knee to any man, nor kiss his foot. The solution was both hilarious and symbolic. Rollo ordered one of his men to perform the ritual in his place. The Viking grabbed the king's foot, yanked it upwards, and kissed it so forcefully that Charles the Simple toppled backwards onto the ground. Gasps echoed through the court, but the deal stood. From this moment forward, the region became known as the Land of the Northmen, Normandy. Rollo's people were no longer outsiders, they were Normans, no longer pirates but dukes, knights, merchants and landowners. The sea wolves had become landlords. But here's the twist, the Vikings did not simply colonise Normandy, Normandy colonised them. Within a generation, the Norse language faded. The grandchildren of Rollo spoke French. They dressed like French nobles, married into Frankish families, and adopted Latin law and Catholic Christianity. But they retained the one thing that had always defined them: aggression. Normandy became a war machine, a forge for knights, a place where the Old Norse hunger for adventure fused with the Frankish obsession with hierarchy and cavalry, and the consequences would echo for centuries. Rollo himself adapted to the role of duke with astonishing ease. He divided the land among his captains, built fortresses, organised taxes, and enforced laws. His rule was brutal but stable. For the first time in a century, the Seine was quiet. The coast was safe. Other Viking fleets no longer raided Normandy because Normandy was now defended by the most ruthless Vikings of all. But peace at home did not mean peace everywhere. The Normans still looked outward, still sought lands to conquer, and Rollo's descendants would not be content to simply rule one duchy. In the year 1066, 150 years after Rollo's deal, his great-great-great-grandson, a man named William the Bastard, later called William the Conqueror, crossed the English Channel with an army of Norman knights and shattered the Anglo-Saxon kingdom at the Battle of Hastings. It is not hyperbole to say that the modern history of England, its monarchy, its language, its law begins with that invasion. An invasion launched not by a Frenchman, but by the descendant of a Viking who once refused to kneel, and the irony does not stop there. Today, the British royal family traces its lineage in part back to Rollo. So do countless noble houses across Europe. A man who began life as a sea raider, a criminal by every metric of his time, became, by accident of ambition and adaptation, the father of kings. But what makes Rollo's story truly strange is how accidental it all was. He did not plan to found a duchy. He did not set out to build a dynasty. He wanted silver. He wanted land. He wanted survival. And when the opportunity came, he took it not by bowing, but by standing taller than anyone else in the room. The question that haunts historians is simple. Was Rollo unique? Was he an exceptional figure, a once-in-a-generation leader? Or was he simply the first of many a symptom of a larger pattern where pirates become princes when the borders are soft enough and the paperwork flexible enough? In some ways, Normandy was not an outlier. It was a preview, because the Viking world was full of men like Rollo, men who began as raiders and became rulers, who flipped the script on what power looked like, who proved that monarchy itself is often just organised piracy, sanctified by time. The legacy of Rollo is not just a story about one man, it is a story about how legitimacy is a fiction, how the line between outlaw and noble is drawn in sand until someone builds a wall around it and calls it a border. And maybe that is the real lesson of the Viking expansion. It was never just about swords and ships. It was about finding the cracks in the old world and wedging themselves in until they owned it. Rollo did not kneel, and neither did the thousands of nameless Norse who followed the rivers, crossed the oceans, and forced the world to make room for them. They arrived as raiders, they left as history. It's one thing to fear a Viking, it's another thing entirely to fear a Viking widow, because while a sword cuts quickly, a widow plots slowly, and sometimes the most terrifying person in a violent world is the one holding no sword at all, only patience, memory, and the ruthless creativity of the truly aggrieved. Her name was Olga of Kiev, a woman remembered not because she ruled, but because of how she made men regret that she ruled. She was not born in Kiev. Like most rulers of the early Kievan Rus, her ancestry was Scandinavian. She was a descendant of the Varangians, Norse traders, pirates, and mercenaries who had ridden the great river systems of Eastern Europe south, building a fragile empire from the bones of Slavic tribes and Byzantine silver. By the early 10th century, the Rus were no longer raiders in the traditional sense. They were merchants, warlords, and tax collectors, running a sprawling network that connected the Baltic to Baghdad. But their hold on power was thin. The rulers were a Norse military minority, governing a Slavic majority, often by sheer force. Olga married into this fragile arrangement. Her husband was Igor of Kiev, the grandson of Rurik, the Norse founder of the Rus dynasty. Igor's job, like most Rus rulers, was part king, part mafia boss. He collected tribute often by violence from the Slavic tribes under his protection, and in the year 945, he got greedy. Igor went to the Drevlians, a tribe west of Kiev, demanding a second payment of tribute. The Drevlians, understandably annoyed, offered him a different payment. They tied him to 2 bent sapling trees, lashed one leg to each trunk, and then let the trees go. The sapling sprang upright, Igor did not. The Drevlians then made a fatal mistake. They assumed the game was over, the king was dead, the Rus would be leaderless, so they sent envoys to Olga with a proposal: marry one of our princes, become our queen, let us absorb Kiev into the Drevlian Confederation. It is hard to imagine what those envoys thought as they arrived at Olga's court. Perhaps they imagined her grateful, powerless, ready to negotiate. Instead, Olga smiled, and then she buried them alive. According to the primary chronicle, a medieval history of the Rus written by monks a century later, Olga had her servants dig a massive pit inside the walls of Kiev. The Drevlian envoys were invited to a feast, welcomed as honoured guests, given food, drink and comfort. Then, mid-toast, the floor opened beneath them. They tumbled into the pit, and the earth closed over them. But this was only step one. Olga sent a message to the Drevlians. Yes, she said, I accept your proposal of marriage, but tradition demands you send your highest-ranking nobles to escort me to your prince. Only with the full honour of your tribe can I become your queen. The Drevlians agreed. They sent their elders, their war leaders, their most respected men. When they arrived in Kiev, Olga offered them hospitality. A bathhouse had been prepared, she told them. Warm water, clean linen, rest after their long journey. The men entered the bathhouse, stripped down and relaxed. Olga's soldiers barred the door and set the bathhouse on fire. No one came out. Still, it was not enough. Olga sent a third message to the Drevlians. She was on her way, she said, to honour her late husband with a funeral feast at the site of his death. The Drevlians were invited to join, to celebrate the alliance soon to be forged. A great feast was held. The Drevlians drank, and drank, and drank. When they were blind with wine, Olga's warriors rose. 3,000 Drevlian men were slaughtered on the spot, but still it was not finished. The Drevlian capital, the city of Iskorostan, barred its gates. Now they understood. Now they saw. Olga marched her army to the walls. A siege began, but taking a fortified city was no easy task. Even the Rus knew that. The longer the siege dragged on, the more dangerous it became. Other tribes might rebel, other rivals might strike. So Olga offered mercy. Send me a token of submission, she said. I will spare you. All I ask is a small tribute. Each household shall send me 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows. The Drevlians, baffled but relieved, agreed. Birds were plentiful, and what was a bird compared to their lives? When the birds arrived, Olga gave an order. Her soldiers tied pieces of sulphur-bound cloth to the feet of each pigeon and sparrow. As dusk fell, they set the cloth alight. The birds panicked, burning, flew home, to their nests. Their nests, inside the wooden rooftops of Iskorostan. The city went up like a funeral pyre. When the flames rose, the gates opened. Some tried to flee, others tried to surrender. Olga's forces slaughtered many, enslaved others. The rest were left to rebuild what was now part of the Rus. It was not just revenge, it was statecraft. And it worked. Olga ruled as regent for her young son, Sviatoslav. And during her reign, the Rus transformed. The days of pure Viking plunder were ending. Olga saw that survival meant more than swords. It meant alliances, infrastructure, diplomacy. In the year 957, she travelled to Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, as an ambassador. There she met Emperor Constantine VII. Impressed by her intelligence, discipline, and perhaps her terrifying reputation, he offered her baptism into the Orthodox Christian faith. She accepted, but not entirely. While she was baptized and took the Christian name Helena, Olga refused to force her people to convert. She understood power. The Rus were still a pagan warrior society. Her own son mocked her Christianity, calling it weak. Olga, ever patient, ever calculating, did not push. She built churches, established diplomatic ties, and waited. It would be her grandson, Vladimir the Great, who finished the job forcibly baptizing the Rus, burning the pagan idols, and turning the Norse-Slavic hybrid state into a Christian empire. But the scaffolding was Olga's, and the fire that burned Iskorostan was the fire that forged a kingdom. Today she is remembered not as a Viking queen, but as St. Olga of Kiev, canonized by the Orthodox Church, a holy figure, a bringer of faith. And yet, behind every icon, every gilded mosaic, every whisper of sainthood, the birds still fly. The bathhouse still burns. The pit still yawns open. Because Olga's story is not simply one of violence or one of faith. It is the story of what happens when the old world tips into the new. When pirates become princes, when raiders become rulers, when the hand that once drew a sword learns how to hold a scepter. And if history whispers one truth through the bones of this story, it is this. Never ever mistake mercy for weakness. If you stood on the black stone beaches of southern Iceland in the 9th century and looked inland, the first thing you'd notice was the silence. No human voices, no villages, no plumes of hearth smoke, just ice, mountains, lava fields steaming from unseen rivers of fire beneath. And the wind, the kind of wind that wraps itself around your bones and whispers one question. Who on earth would choose to live here? The answer, as it turns out, is everyone who didn't fit in anywhere else. Iceland was not empty. Not really. The Norse saw it as a land without owners, but long before their sails cut the Atlantic, Irish monks had come here. Anchorites, hermits, solitude seekers who wanted to pray where nothing could distract them except the weather and the haunting quiet of the glaciers. They lived in turf huts, lit candles in caves, but they left or disappeared by the time the Norse arrived, either driven out by the new wave of settlers or choosing, once again, to vanish into silence. By the late 800s, Norway was changing. A local warlord named Harald Fairhair had begun turning a loose patchwork of chieftains into a kingdom. It was not a process anyone enjoyed. Harald's consolidation meant taxes, bureaucracy, laws enforced by someone other than your cousins. The old freewheeling way where disputes were solved with axes or arranged marriages was dying. So the misfits left. The second sons, the stubborn daughters, the outlaws, the dreamers, the pirates without a purpose. And they found Iceland. It was not a paradise. The soil was thin, the summers short. Winters were an exercise in creative starvation, but it was free. No kings, no landlords, no armies. The settlement began around the year 874. The first to claim land was Ingolfur Arnason, the Norwegian exile who tossed the carved wooden pillars of his high seat into the sea and vowed to settle wherever they washed ashore. They landed at a place he named Reykjavik, the smoky bay where geothermal steam rose from the ground like ghost fires. And then came the flood, dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, entire family clans, Irish slaves, Norse artisans, fishermen, farmers, warriors, outlaws, and a society built from the parts that other societies discarded. But here's where Iceland flips the script. Unlike most Viking colonies, Ireland, York, Normandy, Iceland wasn't about conquest. There were no locals to subjugate, no monasteries to sack. It was a blank slate, geographically hostile but politically utopian if your definition of utopia included frostbite, chronic food insecurity, and occasional lava. What they built was something astonishing, a decentralized republic, a nation without kings. At the centre of it was the Althing, founded in the year 930, one of the oldest continuous parliaments in the world. Every summer, free men and sometimes free women travelled to Thingvellir, the Assembly Plains. There, surrounded by cliffs and water, they camped for weeks, settled disputes, made laws, renewed alliances, passed judgments. The law itself was oral, memorised, recited by the law speaker, a man elected for his ability to remember word for word the entire legal code. He would stand atop the law rock and chant the laws aloud 1/3 each year so that every 3 years the entire corpus of Icelandic law had been spoken into the air. It was functionally a giant open-air courtroom combined with a summer festival. There were feasts, markets, marriages arranged, news exchanged, laws declared, and sentences carried out sometimes with fines, sometimes with exile, and sometimes with blood. This was not democracy as we imagine it. Power still flowed through families, wealth, and alliances, but it was participatory in a way that the feudal kingdoms of Europe could not even imagine. And within this strange frostbitten experiment, something else began to happen, a literary explosion. The Icelandic sagas are one of the great literary miracles of the medieval world. Written down between the 12th and 14th centuries but passed orally for generations before that, they are sprawling, brutal, hilarious, and deeply human. These were not fairy tales. They were family histories. Epics of revenge, lawsuits, feuds, migration, and honour. Men duel over insults. Women orchestrate blood feuds from behind the loom. A man's fortune rises or falls based on the cleverness of his insult or the sharpness of his sword. Ghosts walk the hills, trolls haunt the edges, but the real monsters are often the neighbours. And unlike most medieval literature, women are not footnotes. In Saga Iceland, women could inherit farms, manage estates, initiate divorce. They could be plaintiffs in lawsuits, or defendants, or as happens often, the secret architects behind a blood feud that lasted generations. Consider Aud the Deep-Minded, a widowed matriarch who captained her own ship to Iceland after her family fell from power in the British Isles. She claimed land, built a settlement, managed a household of freed slaves and dependents. When she died, she was given a ship burial and honour reserved for chieftains. Or Gudrun Osvifsdottir, the central figure of Laxdæla saga who married 4 times, orchestrated legal and personal chaos across the entire fjord, and whose final act was to become a nun, the only person in the saga who ends with both peace and power. Iceland produced not kings, but stories, and those stories carried weight. Because in a society without centralized power, memory becomes law. Your reputation is currency, your lineage is a legal document. The sagas were not just entertainment, they were databases of who owed what to whom, who insulted whom, who carried out vengeance and who failed. It is tempting to think of this as quaint, picturesque, but it wasn't. The same Iceland that wrote the sagas also practiced outlawry, a sentence that rendered a man legally killable by anyone with no consequences. Families maintained execution stones at the edges of their farms. The sagas are full of passages like, "And then he struck off his head, and that was the end of it." The weather was not the only harsh thing here, and yet it worked. For 2 centuries, Iceland functioned as a non-state. No king, no standing army, no police. Disputes were settled through a combination of lawsuits, violence, mediation, and crucially public shaming. If you were declared guilty at the Althing, the sentence could be exile, or fine, or death. But sometimes the worst punishment was simply that the entire society now knew your name, and knew you were a man who broke his word. What other society in the medieval world could say the same? By the year 1000, the Icelanders faced a new crisis: religion. Europe had gone Christian. Norway had gone Christian at sword point. The Icelandic population was divided, and civil war seemed inevitable. So they did something utterly characteristic. They argued, at the Althing, for days. And then, in one of the strangest moments in medieval history, both sides agreed to pick one man, the law speaker, to decide. He would think about it overnight, and whatever he decided, both sides would accept. The next morning he declared Iceland Christian, the idols would come down, churches would be built, baptisms performed. But pagans could still practice in private. It was not a perfect compromise, but it avoided war. No kings, no holy crusades, just a vote. For a time, Iceland's autonomy lasted until the 13th century, when internal strife known as the Sturlung era shattered the fragile balance of power. The island was absorbed into the Norwegian crown. The Free Republic was over. But the sagas remained, and perhaps that is Iceland's real conquest. Long after the Viking raids ended, after the kingdoms fell, after the swords rusted, the stories still travelled. Into Europe, into modern literature, into the deep code of how the world remembers the North. Because Iceland was never empty. It was full of wind, of ice, of lava, of memory, of words sharp enough to cut even the darkest winter. Every colonization story begins with one small crucial lie. Greenland's just happened to be written directly into its name. Erik Thorvaldsson. Better known as Erik the Red, was not a man famous for honesty, or patience, or diplomacy. He was famous for manslaughter, exile, and a particular shade of fiery red hair that matched both his temper and, eventually, his sales pitch. Born in Norway sometime in the 10th century, Erik came from a long tradition of problematic Vikings. His father had been exiled for killing a man, a family hobby Eric would continue. The Thorvaldsen family fled to Iceland when Eric was a child, but Iceland wasn't quite the untouched wilderness that it had once been. The good land was taken. The free-for-all spirit of the early settlers had begun to harden into property laws, lawsuits, and grudges that didn't forgive. And Eric, being Eric, did not adapt. A property dispute, a feud, a few unfortunate deaths, and suddenly Eric was declared an outlaw, a status that meant anyone could kill him on sight legally. He had 3 years to leave Iceland or become a corpse-shaped warning about respecting court rulings. So he sailed west, not entirely blind. There were rumours. Old sailors told of a land glimpsed beyond the western horizon. Others had been blown off course and come back with stories of a jagged coastline, ice-locked but habitable. Eric followed the trail, spent 3 years mapping the edges of this strange place, and made a discovery. It was brutal, but it was possible. The fjords in the south were ice-free in summer. There was grass, enough for livestock if you were stubborn, enough for hay if you were fast, and there was no one else there. No kings, no rivals, no courts, no one to tell Eric the Red how to live. But Eric also knew something else. If he went back to Iceland and told the truth that this new land was freezing, isolated, and one bad winter away from mass death, no one would follow him. So he named it Greenland, a masterclass in spin. It would, the saga says bluntly, attract settlers if it had a good name. And it worked. By the year 985, Eric had recruited a fleet of 25 ships, 14 made it. The others vanished storms, shipwreck, bad luck. Those who arrived set up 2 main settlements along the ice-free southwestern coast, the eastern settlement and the western settlement. And for a while, incredibly, it worked. The settlers brought cattle, sheep, goats. They hunted seals, walrus, caribou. They built turf houses like in Iceland, but with thicker walls. They fished the rich coastal waters. Trade routes connected them back to Europe mostly for iron, timber, and luxury goods, since Greenland itself had none of those things. And they adapted, sort of. But here's where the story bends away from the romantic version, away from the rugged Norse farmers battling the elements. Because Greenland was never a perfect fit. It was never self-sustaining. From the start, it was a gamble, a colony sitting on the razor's edge of what was possible for medieval humans to survive. The Norse were land-based people. Their farming methods, raising cattle and sheep, were designed for the green hills of Norway and Iceland, not the fragile tundra ecosystem of Greenland. Their heavy reliance on grazing led to rapid soil erosion. Over a few generations, the thin, topsoil peeled away under hooves and frost. Winters lengthened, summers shortened, ice crept southward, and then came the Little Ice Age. Around the 14th century, global temperatures dipped, a shift so subtle it would be invisible to modern eyes but catastrophic to marginal societies. Growing seasons collapsed, hay yields plummeted, cattle died, people starved, and the North Atlantic sea lanes, already treacherous, froze over more frequently, cutting Greenland off from the vital supply ships out of Norway. Meanwhile, there were neighbours. The Thule Inuit, ancestors of today's Greenlandic people, arrived from the Canadian Arctic around the 12th century, technologically far better suited to the environment than the Norse. The Inuit hunted seals through ice holes. They built kayaks, used dog sleds. Their houses were warmer. Their diets adapted to the ice. There is archaeological evidence that the Norse and the Inuit interacted trading goods, sometimes fighting, sometimes cooperating. But the Norse never adopted Inuit technology. No kayaks, no seal hunting techniques, no dog sleds. They clung stubbornly to what had worked in Norway, as if the land itself would eventually bend to their will. It didn't. By the early 15th century, the Western settlement vanished. Completely. No written record, no explanation, just abandoned houses, empty churches, and scattered bones. The Eastern settlement limped on for another half-century before it too collapsed. The last written record comes from the year 1415, a church record noting a wedding. After that, silence. When a ship finally arrived decades later, sent by the Norwegian king, they found nothing. Farms empty, churches roofless, fields overgrown. The Greenland colony had died, not in a single disaster, but in a long, cold surrender. A slow grinding failure of adaptation, climate, and distance. But Eric's lie? It worked longer than anyone had a right to expect. For 400 years, families lived there, married, raised children, buried their dead beneath carved stone crosses in fields that are, today, frost-shattered and silent. It is easy, maybe too easy, to frame this as failure. To say that the Norse lost because they refused to change, because they could not let go of their old-world farming, their cattle, their hay, their stone churches. But maybe it is something stranger. Maybe Greenland was never meant to succeed in the usual way. Maybe it was an outpost of psychological survival, a place where the descendants of raiders proved, to themselves and to the gods, that they could live at the very edge of the possible, that they could look at a place the earth itself had declared uninhabitable and say no, we will build here anyway, a lie but one that became true for a while, through sheer force of will. And maybe that is the Viking story in miniature. Not just about conquest, or plunder, or war, but about humans who refuse to accept the limits of their own maps. Greenland, the Greenland, it was never green. But it was a place, a memory, a chapter in the long, defiant argument between humans and the world. The strangest thing about the Viking Age is not that they reached America, it's that they left. Imagine it. You're standing on a beach in what today is Newfoundland. The wind smells different here. There are grapes, actual wine grapes growing in the hills, thick forests, fish so abundant they practically leap into your hands. Deer, meadows, timber, every single thing Greenland and Iceland could never offer. And yet within a handful of years, the Norse walked away. They left no cities, no colonies, no carved rune stones declaring we were here. Just a whisper in a saga, a ruin of turf walls beneath the grass, a question that still lingers like mist over the Atlantic. Why? The story of Vinland begins like all good Viking disasters with someone getting lost. Sometime around the year 986, a Norwegian merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson set sail from Iceland in search of Greenland. But Bjarni was a merchant, not an explorer. His ship got blown off course, he drifted west, far west, and caught sight of a coastline. He didn't land, didn't map it, he simply looked. Trees, rolling hills. Then he turned around and went back to Greenland to find his family. Bjarni was mocked. What kind of sailor finds an entire continent and doesn't bother to go ashore? But one person listened. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, grandson of outlaws, child of Greenland's lie. Leif bought Bjarni's ship, outfitted it, gathered a crew, and followed the whispered coastline into the west. What he found was staggering. First, a place they called Helluland, the land of flat stones. Probably Baffin Island. Cold, harsh, unwelcoming. Further south, Markland, the land of forests. Likely Labrador, thick with timber, game, and rivers. And then, the prize, Vinland, a place with meadows, rivers, salmon fat enough to burst, wild grapes curling over the hills. The sagas say they overwintered it there, built houses, called it Leifsbudir, Leif's camp, and it worked, for one winter. But something was watching. The sagas call them skrælings, a word that means little scraps, or little men, probably a Norse insult for anyone not themselves. These were the First Nations of the Atlantic coast, likely ancestors of the Beothuk, people who had lived on these shores for thousands of years. They were not strangers to the land, they were the land. The first meetings were cautious, gifts exchanged, trade attempted. But the Norse were not subtle neighbours. The sagas speak of misunderstandings escalating over weapons, over trade, over territory, a skirmish, a death. And then, as it always does, everything spiralled. The Norse retreated to their ships. The skrælings returned in numbers far more than the Greenlanders had ever imagined. Arrows rattled off shields, stones flew. The saga says the Norse saw a great dark mass swelling toward them from the forest. Outnumbered, cut off, they fled. Vinland was paradise, but it was someone else's paradise. And it became clear that whatever the Norse wanted here, timber, furs, farmland, they would have to take it by force. And the Norse were many things, but they were not numerous. Greenland could not supply an army, Iceland could not reinforce a colony. Norway was too far, too preoccupied. Still, the story was not over. Enter Freydis Eiriksdottir. If Leif Erikson was the cautious explorer, Freydis was not. The saga paints her as Eric the Red's true heir, violent, shrewd, and terrifyingly competent. Freydis joined one of the follow-up expeditions to Vinland with 2 other crews, led by men named Helgi and Finnbogi. It started badly. Before they even reached Vinland, Freydis tricked her companions. She convinced them to split the ships equally but smuggled extra men aboard her vessel. By the time the others realised it was too late, they arrived, built a joint camp, but resentment simmered, and then, as always, came blood. Freydis accused Helgi and Finnbogi of insulting her. Of breaking the agreement, she told her husband to kill them. He refused. So Freydis picked up an axe and did it herself. Personally, methodically, she killed every man in their camp. Then, when her own men balked at murdering the 5 women left alive, she grabbed the axe again. None survived. The saga says she then threatened her own crew. If any of you speak of this when we return to Greenland, you will meet the same fate. It worked. For a while. But stories leak, even in Greenland. Freydis was never punished. There was no king to enforce such things, but her reputation soured. Her descendants would later flee to Eambiland rather than face the shame. As for Vinland, the colony disintegrated. One final expedition tried again, led by Thorfinn Karlsefni, who brought cattle and intended to stay permanently. It lasted 3 years. The land was rich, but the wars with the Skraelings never ended. Every attempt at trade collapsed into violence. The Norse lived by the sword, but this time the math was against them. There were simply too few of them, too few men, too few ships, too few reasons to stay. And perhaps, deep down, they knew something else. The Norse were still the same people who had left Norway, because kings had begun drawing lines on the map, because the old world of small-scale freedom was being crushed under crowns, taxes and laws. To stay in Vinland would mean one day becoming those kings, building walls, waging wars not against neighbours, but against an entire continent. It was not the Viking way. So they left. Not defeated, but not victorious. Vinland became a ghost story, a whispered memory, an almost empire that never happened. Centuries later, when European explorers rediscovered North America, the Norse were long gone. No runestones marked the land, no Norse-descended villages remained. Only sagas, half history, half myth, spoke of the time when the serpent ships crossed the sea and found a world they were not meant to hold. But the ruins are still there. At Lance O Meadows in Newfoundland, a turf-walled settlement, confirmed, dated, real. Vinland was real, and it was a disaster. There are ruins of turf walls on the tip of Newfoundland, shallow stone circles where houses once stood, a blacksmith's forge, long cold, iron nails left by hands that crossed an ocean 1,000 years ago, a place that should not exist, and yet it does. The Norse discovered America, and then, just as quickly, they forgot. Not in the way that myths fade over time, not in the way that memories naturally decay. This was deliberate, a forgetting wrapped in pride, in shame, in survival. A decision, whether conscious or collective, to bury a memory so deep that even the sagas nearly erased it. Because when the Norse left Vinland, they left more than a settlement. They left the most dangerous idea they had ever encountered, an idea that scared them, an idea they couldn't solve, because Vinland was the place where the Norse realised the sea had limits. For 3 centuries, the Norse expansion had been unstoppable. From the Caspian to Constantinople, from Kiev to Dublin, from Greenland to Iceland, they had carved highways through the sea, built kingdoms without kings, colonies without maps. They thrived not because they were conquerors in the traditional sense, but because the ocean let them be something else, fluid, flexible, decentralized. And then they hit America, a place too large to raid, too vast to hold, too full of people who were not impressed by the swords or ships or swagger. The Skraeling Wars were not battles in the heroic sense. They were reminders that the Norse were suddenly small, outnumbered, outmaneuvered. The sea could not save them here. But the deeper problem was psychological. Because the Norse identity, the one thing that unified traders, raiders, farmers and poets, was built on a story that said the edge of the world could be crossed, that any coastline was a challenge waiting to be solved with timber and courage, that nowhere was too far, that no one was unconquerable. Vinland broke that story, and when a story breaks, so does the memory. The sagas themselves hint at this fracture. The Vinland sagas, Granlandinga saga and Eirik's saga, Rauda, are written centuries after the fact, with contradictions so blatant they feel like arguments preserved on paper. Did Leif Erikson discover Vinland first, or was it Bjarni? Were the Skrælings hostile from the start, or did the Norse provoke them? Did Freydis murder a rival crew because of a broken deal, or was she simply a berserker looking for an excuse? It is not just that the sagas disagree, it is that the sagas seem uncomfortable. The Vinland episodes are outliers. They lack the neat resolutions of the Icelandic sagas, where a blood feud ends in a marriage alliance or a lawsuit. They lack the glory of the king-slaying legends or the trade conquests of the Rus. Vinland is neither a victory nor a tragedy. It is a failure, an unsatisfying, unresolved, deeply embarrassing failure. And as the Norse world changed, the reasons to remember it grew thinner. Christianity was one reason. By the year 1000, Iceland had converted reluctantly but officially. Greenland followed. Norway and Denmark were already under the cross. And the old pagan values, the sea kings, the blood feuds, the idea that to die with a sword in your hand was better than to kneel, began to crumble. Vinland did not fit into the Christian story. It was a pagan voyage, a pagan dream, undertaken by men and women who still believed that Odin's eye watched the sea, that the world had no edges except the ones they were brave enough to erase. And in the Christian worldview, what did Vinland mean? That the pagan explorers had found a new world only to lose it? Only to fight with pagans even stranger than themselves? Only to abandon it because war and sin and greed failed? No monk wanted to copy that into the record books. And then came the weather. The Little Ice Age began tightening its grip in the 14th century. Greenland, already a fragile colony, began to starve. Trade routes froze, hay crops failed. The Norse abandoned the western settlement entirely. The eastern settlement faded into isolation, slowly grinding toward extinction. With Greenland cut off, the very people who held the memory of Vinland, the families who had gone there, fought there, farmed there, were themselves disappearing. And Iceland? Iceland had problems of its own. Civil war, volcanoes, climate collapse. By the 14th century, the literary explosion of the sagas was over. The memory keepers were gone. And Norway, Denmark, the kingdoms of Scandinavia were now fully European. Monarchies, bureaucracies, their eyes turned south towards trade with Germany, the Netherlands, England. Vinland was irrelevant to a world that now measured power in coin and kingship, not in fjords and freedom. And yet, the memory lingered, like a ghost in the sagas. When later scholars in Europe began hearing strange rumours of land to the west, of islands beyond the sea, the Norse stories floated back up. In the year 1477, an Italian explorer named Christopher Columbus visited Iceland. He heard whispers of the old voyages. Whether he believed them is unknown. Whether they shaped his voyage is debated. But the fact remains. The Norse had already done it. They had crossed, built, failed, forgotten. And when Europe finally stumbled onto the Americas 5 centuries later, it arrived without knowing that the maps it drew were already echoes. Ghost trails left by ships with serpent prows and sails full of a wind that no longer blew. And perhaps that is the most Viking ending of all. Not a battle, not a victory, not a monument, just a memory, buried and waiting. There is one story almost no one tells about Vinland, a story hidden not in the sagas, but in the bones of another people. The other side of the shoreline. Because while the Norse sagas framed the Vinland voyages as a footnote in the Viking story, for the First Nations of the North Atlantic it was a footnote in something far larger. Their own epic, their own map. To the Beothuk people, the Norse were not mythical. They were not gods from the sea nor legends made flesh. They were simply another arrival in a long line of arrivals. And they were not the first. The coastlines of Newfoundland had already seen waves of migration long before the longships appeared on the horizon. Archaeological sites along the Red Bay, Port au Choix and the Labrador coast reveal an older maritime story, the story of the maritime archaic, the Paleo-Eskimos, and the Dorset people who hunted seals, carved tools from whalebone, and tracked the icy edges of the sea thousands of years before a Viking ever touched a mast. These were not people living in the shadow of nature, they were masters of it. Their boats were light, fast and designed for ice. Their tools were precise, portable, designed for season that flipped from cruel to kind and back again. They read the ice like the Norse read the stars. And by the time the Norse arrived in Vinland, the Beothuk descendants of these ancient lineages already had a map. Not a map written in ink, a map written in memory. Every inlet, every shoal, every river where the salmon would run, or where the seals would surface, or where driftwood would pile high after a storm. When the Norse came ashore, it was not discovery, it was intrusion. The Beothuk saw them first. They would have heard the hammering of the shipwrights before they saw the hulls. They would have smelled the fires, watched the strange new cattle unloaded onto the beaches, creatures never before seen on this continent, and they would have weighed them. Are these traders, raiders, spirits, men? And then the answer came quickly, when the first gift soured. When the first misunderstanding turned to violence, when the iron was lifted as sword instead of plough. The sagas say that the Norse saw the Skraelings as strange, cowardly, untrustworthy, but to the Beothuk the Norse must have seemed suicidally reckless. Large, slow-moving animals, building permanent camps on a land that did not welcome permanence, bringing herds that destroyed berry grounds, cutting timber where the beavers were needed, hunting too much in one place. Using space like Europeans, not like travellers. For the Beothuk, space was something negotiated, cycled, left to rest, but the Norse built fences, and a fence, in this world, was a declaration of war. It is likely that the Beothuk never intended a war of extermination, but when the Norse struck first, or perhaps when a theft turned to death, the calculus shifted. The Norse were few, the forests were many, and there are few easier enemies to outmaneuver than people who cannot read the silence of the trees. The sagas speak of dark shapes swelling from the woods, of ambush, of skirmish lines too large to count, of warriors hidden behind boulders, using the landscape itself as a weapon, of arrows that seem to come from the ground and the sky at once. But there is something the sagas do not say. They do not say whether the Norse realised they were not just fighting one tribe, because the Beothuk were not alone. The Mi'kmaq to the south, the Innu to the north, the Dorset further west, these were not isolated pockets. They were threads in a web older than Europe's own states, and word travels faster than ships. By the time the Norse tried to settle Vinland, the Atlantic coast already knew what they were, and they closed ranks. This may explain something the sagas never quite admit. Why the Norse left not after one bad battle, but after a pattern of every attempt at settlement collapsing, not from one war, not from one loss, but from an ecosystem of resistance. And there is a deeper irony. While the Norse forgot Vinland, while the sagas let it fade into uncomfortable rumour, the memory did not die on the other side of the sea. Among the oral traditions of the Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk survive fragments of a strange encounter, tales of pale-skinned people in floating houses, of men who carried iron axes but could not live without their strange animals, of a camp that appeared by the water, then vanished. The Beothuk word for these outsiders is lost. No written record survives. No one knows exactly how they describe the Norse, but the bones remember, the layers of fire-scorched earth, the arrowheads lodged in collapsed turf walls, the iron nails scattered in the midden piles where no iron should have existed. A memory written not in saga but in soil. And then, as quickly as they came, the Norse were gone. Their floating houses vanished beyond the horizon. Their cows left no descendants. Their walls collapsed. The forest swallowed the camps. The shorelines fell silent again, except for the whisper of the wind, the same wind that blew them here, the same wind that took them home, or perhaps took them somewhere else entirely. The first thing we have to say, and this might break something sacred in you, is that the word Viking does not mean what you think it does. It never did. The Norse were never called Vikings, not as a people, not as a nation, not even as a tribe. To go a Viking or Viking in Old Norse was a verb, a profession, a seasonal gig. Roughly translated, it meant something like to go raiding by sea, or to seek wealth abroad through piracy. It was not an ethnicity, it was not a culture. It was not a race of horn-helmeted marauders with matching beards and axes. It was a job. A side hustle, a temporary state of being. Not everyone did it. In fact, most did not. The people we call Vikings were farmers, carpenters, traders, poets, parents, goat herders, shipwrights, blacksmiths, fishers. Some were merchants who never lifted a sword. Some were raiders who never came home. And most were simply people Scandinavian. Yes, but divided by dialect, geography, clan and ambition. No one in the year 800 stood on the shores of Norway and said, "We are Vikings." The word itself shows up in runic inscriptions, but always as an action. He went a Viking, not he was a Viking, and yet here we are. 1,000 years later, we call them the Vikings, we build museums for them, we romanticize them, fear them, cosplay them, sell them as mascots for football teams, tattoo runes on our arms and name our metal bands after Odin. So how did this happen? How did a job description become a civilization? The answer, like most answers in European history, begins with monks. When the longships hit the monastery at Lindisfarne in the year 793, the Christian world was stunned. The scribes who chronicled this were not neutral observers. They were the victims. They watched their brothers be slaughtered, watched their holy books burn, watched the gold and silver walk out the door in the hands of men who spoke no Latin and feared no cross. And when they wrote it down, they were not subtle. Heathens from the north came like wolves upon the flock, a scourge sent by God for our sins, the devil's own people. This was not just journalism, it was theology. In a worldview where everything had a divine reason, the arrival of raiders had to be explained. And the explanation was simple. The Northmen were not merely men, they were punishment. They were chaos incarnate. Pagan horror made flesh. And the word Vikingar slipped from its Norse usage into Latin chronicles as a label. The Vikings came. Not some men who went Viking came, but the Vikings. A people was born on parchment, a mistake that became a myth. But monks were not the only myth-makers. Centuries later, after the Viking Age was over, after the kings of Scandinavia had traded their gods for crosses and their longships for bureaucracies, a new kind of myth-making began. This time it was not born of fear, it was born of romance. In the 19th century, as Europe was swept up in Romanticism, that fever dream of medieval nostalgia, nationalism and Gothic revival, the image of the Viking was reinvented. No longer pagan devils. Now they were rugged individualists, free men, untamed by church or crown, noble savages but with better hair. Painters imagined them standing on windswept cliffs. Writers conjured sagas of fearless adventurers. Ragnar gave them horns which no Viking ever wore, and opera gave them drama. And crucially, nationalism gave them purpose. In Germany, in Britain, in Sweden, in Denmark, the Viking image became political, a symbol of masculine freedom, of ethnic destiny, of imperial right. The British said, "We are descended from Vikings, that is why we rule the seas." The Germans said, "The Viking blood is Aryan blood, the pure blood of the North," a belief that would metastasize into horrors in the 20th century. In Sweden and Norway, the Viking became an icon of independence, of resistance against foreign kings, of ancestral greatness. And so the word Viking, a job title, became a civilization, a race, a brand, a lie. But it worked. It worked because it was simple, because it made good paintings, good textbooks, good propaganda, because the truth that most Scandinavian men in the year 900 were more likely to be mucking out goat pens than raiding Paris does not sell nearly as well. But the bigger truth is stranger still. The Norse never needed the myth, because what they actually were is far more impressive. They were not an empire, not a nation, not a tribe. They were a network, a decentralized web of kinship, trade, raiding, farming, migration and memory that spanned from Baghdad to Newfoundland. The real story is not that the Vikings were unstoppable warriors. It is that the Norse invented a way of life that made borders irrelevant. Their ships were passports. Their language, Old Norse, became the lingua franca of ports from Dublin to Novgorod. Their trade routes connected the Islamic world to the frozen north. Their silver came from Baghdad, their silk from Constantinople, their slaves from the British Isles. Their stories passed mouth to mouth became the great sagas of the medieval world. They did this without emperors, without armies, without a written map. And that is what the word Viking cannot contain. It cannot contain the fact that half of them never lifted a sword. It cannot contain the fact that their greatest legacy was not conquest but connection. It cannot contain the fact that the Vikings, as we imagine them, never existed. But something else did. Something stranger. Something harder to define. A species of human being who for 300 years lived as though the map was made of water and everything else was negotiable. If the modern mind made one mistake about the Norse, it was thinking they were spiritual in the same way we are now. Nature-loving pagans, dreamers, a little barbaric but somehow poetic, horns, ravens, mead, and midnight bonfires. That was not what the Norse believed. The truth is colder, stranger, more horrifying, more honest. Because for the Norse, life was a losing battle against a universe that would always win, and at the centre of it all was Odin, not a god of love, not a god of creation, not even primarily a god of war. Odin was a god of knowledge, but the price of knowing was everything. He was the one-eyed wanderer who had gouged out his own eye to drink from the well of fate. The magician who hung himself from the world tree for 9 nights stabbed with a spear, starving, bleeding, not to save humanity, but to steal the runes. The secret knowledge of reality itself, the patterns of magic, death, destiny. His gift to humanity was not salvation. It was knowing how you would die, knowing that it would not matter. Because the Norse worldview was brutally deterministic. The Norns' 3 primordial women who spun the threads of every life were older than the gods, older than time. What they wrote was final. No prayer would change it. No offering, no mercy. Even the gods were doomed. Even Odin would die. At the end of time at Ragnarok, the great wolf Fenrir would swallow Odin whole. He knew this, and he kept going anyway. This was the core of Norse paganism. Not worship in the modern sense. Not a bargain with heaven, but a grim reckoning. An acceptance that fate was cruel, the world was ending, and all you could do, the only noble thing left, was to meet it with teeth bared and sword raised. And this was the cult of Odin. It was not for everyone. Most Norsemen were farmers who worshipped Thor, god of weather, fertility, protection. Others prayed to Freyr, lord of peace and harvest, or to Njord, master of the sea. But the warriors, the ones who went Viking, they were Odin's, and Odin's price was blood. Human sacrifice was not a rumour in the Norse world. It was a fact. Eyewitness accounts from Arab traveller Ibn Fadlan in the 10th century describe a funeral where a slave girl is offered to accompany her dead master. She is given alcohol, ritual sex, and then as the ship burns, stabbed to death by the priestess known as the Angel of Death. Adam of Bremen, a German chronicler, writes of the temple at Uppsala, a place where every 9 years, 99 men, 99 horses, 99 dogs, and 99 of every living thing were sacrificed, hung in the sacred grove, left to rot among the trees. Even Odin himself demanded hanging. His followers mimicked his self-sacrifice, hanging enemies, prisoners, or sometimes volunteers, offering them to the world tree. This was not death as punishment. It was death as a cosmic transaction. But the strangest offerings were not of bodies, but of minds. The Norse believed that prophecy came through madness, through dismemberment of the self. Shamans known as vulvas, often women, would enter trance states fueled by hallucinogenic mushrooms, chanting and rhythmic drumming to walk the threads of fate, to see beyond time. The word for poetry, skaldskapa, was the same as for sorcery. Poets were seers. To speak the truth about life was to speak about its ending. The sagas are obsessed with foreshadowing. Every hero knows how he will die. He walks toward it anyway. And this is the context, the strange, terrible beauty of it, in which we must place the most infamous ritual of all. The blood eagle. Did it happen? The sagas claim it did. The recipe is simple. The victim, usually a captured king or a hated rival, is bound face down. His ribs are hacked away from his spine. His lungs are pulled out through the gap. They are spread like wings. The blood pools like a sea around the body. And the victim, if legend is to be believed, must not scream. If he screams, his shame lives forever. If he does not, he wins. He becomes a myth. But did it really happen? Historians are split. Some argue it was never real, that it was a poetic metaphor, a Christian misunderstanding of a skaldic verse that described cutting an eagle shape into the back, a symbolic mark of vengeance. Others argue the opposite, that the sagas are precise, that the anatomical descriptions are too accurate to be invented, that the Norse who dismembered bodies for divination, who sacrificed by hanging, by drowning, by fire, would have had no moral obstacle to inventing a death like this. But whether it was real in practice, it was real in meaning. Because the blood eagle was not about the victim, it was about the watchers, it was about performing for the gods, for the Norns, for fate itself. It was saying, if this is the world you made, then let me show you what I can make of it. Even if what I make is horror, even if what I make is death-shaped like wings. And the deeper horror one that Christian monks could never understand is that the Norse did not do this out of cruelty, they did it out of clarity. Because in a world where fate cannot be escaped, the only freedom is how you meet it. And if the universe itself will end, if even the gods will die, then the highest virtue is not obedience, not forgiveness. It is courage, naked, savage, uncompromising. That is the core of the cult of Odin. And that more than any sword or ship or saga is why the Norse will never truly be forgotten. Before there were gods of mercy, before the idea of salvation or sin, there was Odin. Not a god of love, not a god of comfort, not even a god of war in the way we like to imagine. Odin was something stranger, something harder, a force that sat somewhere between knowledge, death, magic and madness. His name in Old Norse meant something like fury or ecstasy, but not the joyful kind. The kind that takes your mind apart and doesn't give it back in the same shape. According to the oldest myths, Odin wasn't always the king of the gods. He had brothers, Vili and Ve. Together, the three of them did the most unspeakable thing the universe had ever seen. They killed Ymir, the first living being, a cosmic frost giant, and from Ymir's dismembered body they built the world. His blood became the oceans, his bones became the mountains, his skull became the sky. The gods themselves were born out of violence, the world was made out of murder, and Odin, standing in the middle of it all, was the one who understood what that meant. He became the god of seeing too much. You've probably heard the story of how Odin gave up one of his eyes. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a transaction. Deep beneath the roots of the world tree there was a well, Mimir's well, filled with the waters of wisdom. Odin wanted to drink from it. The price was an eye. Without hesitation he pulled it out, dropped it into the black water, and from that day forward he walked through the worlds with only one eye, but twice the knowledge. But that wasn't enough. Odin was the kind of god who understood that knowing a little bit was worse than knowing nothing. If the Norns, the three ancient women who wove the fate of all things, knew how every story ended, then Odin needed to learn how to read the threads. So he did something only Odin would do. He climbed the world tree, Yggdrasil, and there he hung himself. For 9 nights and 9 days, Odin dangled between life and death, pierced by his own spear. No food, no water, no comfort, just the wind and the dark and the creaking of the tree that holds the universe together. He wasn't doing this for anyone but himself. No one was watching, no one was cheering him on. He wasn't sacrificing for mankind, he was sacrificing to himself, and at the end of it the runes revealed themselves. Strange symbols full of power and pattern. Letters, but more than letters. Codes for magic, for fate, for speaking things into being. Odin came down from that tree not as a warrior, but as a sorcerer. His tools were not just weapons, they were instruments of fate. His spear, Gungnir, never missed. His golden ring, Draupnir, dripped copies of itself every 9th night, an endless promise of return. 2 wolves, Geri and Freki, stood at his feet. 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin. Thought and memory flew over the world each morning, whispering every secret back to him by dusk. He was not a god you prayed to for good harvests. That was Thor's job. Odin was the god you called when you needed to bend reality, when you needed to speak with the dead, when you were ready to risk your soul for a glimpse behind the curtain. And speaking of the dead, Odin's relationship with them wasn't symbolic. It was literal. Odin ruled over Valhalla, the hall where half the warriors slain in battle were taken. The other half went to Freyja's field, Folkvanga, but Odin's hall was different. It was not heaven, it was not peace, It was a barracks, a waiting room for the apocalypse. The warriors there drank and fought, died and resurrected, again and again, training for the day when they would ride out with Odin at Ragnarok. Odin's interest in the dead went beyond hosting them. In one of the older poems, Baldur's Dreams, Odin rides to the underworld, to Hel, to find answers about his son's coming death. He raises a dead Vulva Osiris from her grave to demand prophecy. The dead woman warns him, there's nothing he can do, the death is coming, and with it the end of the gods. Odin hears this, and goes on anyway. There was another reason Odin stood apart from the other gods: magic. Specifically, a form of Norse magic called Sida, a weaving of fate, a kind of divination and manipulation that often involved trance states, shape-shifting or speaking with spirits. Sida was mostly practiced by women. It carried a social stigma when performed by men. To practice it was to be seen as ergi, a word meaning effeminate, perverse, even morally unclean. But Odin didn't care, he mastered it anyway. Because for Odin, knowledge mattered more than reputation, more than dignity, even more than his own sense of masculinity. He crossed boundaries, always. He was a necromancer, a shapeshifter, a wanderer, a war god, a poet, a manipulator. And his myths weren't just stories, they were warnings. There's the story of the mead of poetry, how Odin seduced a giantess, tricked a guard, transformed into an eagle, and fled with the magical mead that makes poets out of mortals, and how, on the way back, he let a portion of it spill from his backside, an insult written into the cosmos for bad poets and cheap liars. There's the story of Fenrir, the giant wolf fated to kill him at Ragnarok. Odin knew this. He still participated in the wolf's binding, chaining his own doom into the process. And there's the story of Balder, the beloved god whose death would signal the end times. Odin tried to prevent it, rode to the underworld, made sacrifices, but still fate won. It always does. That's the terrifying thing about Odin. In a world where even the gods are doomed, he shows you how to keep walking anyway. That's why warriors loved him. That's why poets feared him. That's why kings gave him offerings. And that's why, even after Christianity swept across Scandinavia, Odin refused to fully disappear. He became the leader of the wild hunt, riding through the winter sky with ghostly soldiers at his back. He haunted the borders between worlds, between life and death, between madness and wisdom. He still does, somewhere, waiting. Because if Odin taught the Norse anything, it was this. You don't get to win, you only get to choose how you lose, and how loudly you sing while it's happening. In the Norse world, if Odin was the god you whispered to before a hopeless battle, or when casting a dangerous spell, Thor was the one you called when you just wanted the storm to pass, the crops to survive, or the frost giants to kindly stay out of your village. Thor, son of Odin and the earth giantess Fjörgyn, was everything Odin was not. Odin was cunning, distant, manipulative. Thor was blunt, immediate, physical, a god of action. Odin spoke in riddles, Thor spoke with his hammer. His role was simple: defend the world. Where Odin travelled the boundaries between life and death, Thor guarded the boundary between order and chaos, between the realm of humans, Midgard, and the dark worlds of the giants, the Jotnar. That was Thor's job, not because he was a king, but because he was built for it. He was the strongest of the gods by an unfathomable margin. His hammer, Mjolnir, was more than just a weapon. It was a cosmic tool. It could flatten a mountain with a single blow or bless a newborn child. It was a symbol of destruction and fertility, of violence and community. The story of how he got it is pure Norse comedy. Loki, ever the instigator, cut off the golden hair of Sif, Thor's wife. Furious, Thor threatened to break every bone in Loki's body. To avoid that, Loki went to the dwarves and bribed them into making Sif a new head of gold which would grow like real hair, along with several other gifts for the gods. One of those was Mjolnir, a hammer so powerful it could kill giants in a single strike. But the dwarves made a mistake during its forging thanks to Loki's meddling, and the handle came out too short. Which is why in most depictions, Thor wields the hammer one-handed. Despite the flaw, it was perfect. A weapon that always returned when thrown, a thunderclap in physical form, and Thor would use it constantly. The Norse cosmos was a fragile place, not a peaceful one. The Jotnar, the frost giants, represented entropy, chaos, wild nature untamed, and they were always testing the boundaries, always trying to break through. Without Thor standing at the edge of the world, smashing skulls and sending lightning ripping across the sky, the borders would fall. That was not just a mythological idea, it was a psychological truth. For the Norse, life was a constant battle against forces that wanted to swallow you. Winter, famine, storms, disease, bandits, everything beyond the farm, the village, the firelight that was the realm of the giants. And Thor was the last line of defence. He lived in a hall called Bilskirnir, the largest building in the cosmos in the realm of Thrudheim. His name literally means thunder. His chariot was pulled by 2 goats, Tangrisnir and Tangnjosta, whose names mean tooth grinder and tooth gnasher. At the end of a long day of killing giants, Thor could slaughter the goats, eat them for dinner, and then resurrect them the next morning as long as their bones remained intact. This trick shows up in the myths when Thor travels to Midgard, disguised as a mortal, and shares a meal with a poor farmer. The farmer's son, hungry, cracks open one of the goat's bones to suck the marrow. The next morning, the goat comes back to life but crippled. Thor, furious but fair, punishes the boy by taking him and his sister as his servants, but does not kill him. A small glimpse into Thor's personality, wrathful yes, but not cruel. Unlike Odin, who was primarily worshipped by aristocrats, kings and warriors, Thor was the god of ordinary people. Farmers, sailors, craftsmen. His hammer was worn as an amulet, a direct counterpart to the Christian cross. In fact, during the Christianization of Scandinavia, many people were buried with both just in case. Thor's stories almost always follow the same rhythm. A threat appears often a giant with too much pride or too clever a scheme. Thor tries diplomacy for about 10 seconds, then someone insults him, then Mjolnir solves the problem, but not all his tales are simple brawls. There's the time when Thor wakes up and finds his hammer missing. Panicking because without Mjolnir, the world's defences are gone, he confronts Loki, who predictably says, "Yeah, I know who did it." It was Thrym, a frost giant king, who demands the goddess Freyja's hand in marriage in exchange for the hammer's return. Freyja refuses, outright. So the gods come up with a plan. They dress Thor up as Freyja. Veil, bridal dress, jewellery the works. Thor, seething with barely contained rage, has to pretend to be a blushing bride while the giants gloat about their brilliant scheme. At the wedding feast, Thor devours an entire ox, 8 salmon, and several barrels of mead. When the suspicious groom asks why his bride eats like a berserker, Loki, always the wingman, says, "Oh, she's just nervous. Hasn't eaten in 8 days out of excitement." When Thrym finally brings out Mjolnir to bless the wedding, placing it on the bride's lap, Thor grabs it. The veil flies off, the hammer swings, and the entire wedding party of giants is reduced to a fine paste. Problem solved. This story, like so many others, shows Thor's role not just as a warrior, but as a protector of cosmic order, even when the solution is ridiculous. But for all his strength, even Thor cannot stop fate. At Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, Thor will face Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, a snake so large it circles the earth, biting its own tail. In their final battle, Thor will kill the serpent, striking it down with Mjolnir, but he only manages to take 9 steps away before collapsing dead, poisoned by the serpent's venom. Even the strongest cannot win forever, but that is the point. Thor, like Odin, knows this. Unlike Odin, he doesn't try to cheat it, doesn't try to outsmart it. He simply stands, hammer in hand, doing the jill, keeping the darkness away, one smashed skull at a time. And that's why, for the common folk of Scandinavia, the farmers, the sailors, the people living on the edge of wilderness, Thor wasn't just a god. He was hope. Hope that someone, somewhere was holding the line, that no matter how bad the storm was, someone was still willing to throw a hammer at it. If Thor was the defender and Odin the seeker, then Loki was the glitch in the system, the walking exception, the loophole dressed as a man, or sometimes as a woman, or a fish, or a horse, or whatever the moment demanded. Loki was not technically one of the Aesir gods. He was a blood brother to Odin, not a biological one. His father was a Jotun, a giant, one of the primal chaotic forces that the gods were constantly at war with. But Loki was adopted, half in, half out, allowed into the halls of Asgard, given a seat among the gods, but never truly one of them. And that, of course, was the problem. Loki's defining trait wasn't evil, not at first. It was cleverness. He was the fixer, the trickster, the one you called when a problem had no solution. But the thing about a fixer is this: The person who can untangle any knot also knows exactly how to tie one. Most of Loki's early myths are comedies. He causes a disaster. The gods rage, threaten to kill him, and Loki panics, comes up with a solution that usually involves another crime, fixes the problem, and walks away, grinning until next time. Take, for example, the time he nearly lost Asgard itself. A mysterious builder appears and offers to build the gods an impenetrable wall. The price, the sun, the moon, and the goddess Freya. The gods laugh. Sure, they say, but only if you finish it in one winter, alone. The builder agrees on one condition. He gets to use his horse. The gods shrug. The horse won't help much, except the horse does help. A lot. Turns out it's not just any horse, it's Svadilfari, a stallion of supernatural strength. Day by day, stone by stone, the wall rises faster than anyone thought possible. Suddenly, the gods realize they're about to lose the sun, the moon, and Freya. Everyone looks at Loki. This was your idea. Loki, realizing his life expectancy has just dropped to minutes, comes up with a plan. On the last night before the deadline, Loki transforms himself into a beautiful mare. Not just any mare, but the most seductive, irresistible mare ever to walk the 9 realms. Svadilfari takes one look, drops his harness, and runs. The builder cannot finish the wall. The gods refuse to pay. The builder reveals himself as a giant and lunges at them in fury, only to be smashed to pieces by Thor's hammer. Problem solved, except not entirely. Several months later, Loki returns to Asgard, with a baby, a horse, an 8-legged, grey-skinned, supernatural horse. His name is Sleipnir, and he will become Odin's mount, able to ride between worlds, between life and death. And that is the perfect summary of Loki's role. The one who breaks the rules to save the rules, the one who causes the problem and becomes the solution. But over time, something shifts. The pranks get darker, the solutions cause bigger problems, and eventually Loki's chaos tips into something else. There's a line in Norse cosmology that Loki crosses. It comes with the birth of his children, 3 of them, each more terrifying than the last. First, the wolf Fenrir, a beast so powerful that the gods fear it from the moment it is born. They try to raise it in Asgard, but it grows too quickly, stronger than any chain they can forge. Eventually, with trickery, they bind it using Gleipnir, a ribbon made from impossible things. The sound of a cat's footsteps, the roots of a mountain, the breath of a fish. Even then, the wolf bites off the hand of Tyr, the god of law, during the binding. But Fenrir waits. It is prophesied that one day he will break free and devour Odin. Second, Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent. Cast into the sea that surrounds the world, it grows so large that it circles the earth, biting its own tail. Its fate is tied to Thor. At Ragnarok they will kill each other. And third, Hel, the half-dead queen of the underworld. Her face is human on one side, corpse-like on the other. Odin, horrified, casts her into the land of the dead, where she rules over all those who die of sickness, old age, or misfortune not in battle. These children are not jokes, they are not clever, they are endings. Loki begins to change. The breaking point comes with Balder. Balder, the shining god, beloved by all, destined to die, but no one knows how. His mother, Frigg, travels the worlds and extracts a promise from every object, every creature, every weapon. Swear not to harm Balder. All agree, except one, a sprig of mistletoe. Too young, too small, too harmless, she thought. Loki finds this out. At the gods' feast, the Aesir amuse themselves by throwing stones, spears, and axes at Balder, who laughs as each one bounces off harmlessly. Loki, smiling, approaches Balder's blind brother, Hörder. Here, he says, try this, I'll help you aim. It is a dart of mistletoe. Hörder throws. Balder falls, dead. The gods scream, panic, the world trembles. Odin knows. This is the first crack, this is how it begins. The attempts to undo the damage fail. Loki mocks them, refuses to help. And now there is no going back. The gods capture him. And Loki's punishment is as brutal as anything in myth. The gods tie him to 3 great stones deep beneath the earth. His own son is slain. His entrails are used to bind Loki in place. Above him they hang a serpent. Its venom drips onto his face, burning him, writhing him in agony. His wife Sigyn holds a bowl to catch the venom, but when she leaves to empty it, the drops fall, and Loki convulses in pain. The Norse said this is why the earth shakes, why earthquakes happen, because Loki still suffers, still waits until Ragnarok, when he will break free, lead the armies of the dead and the giants, and burn the world. But even then, Loki isn't simple. Is he evil or inevitable? He is the boundary that fails, the consequence of systems that believe they are unbreakable. Odin represents fate, Thor represents order, Loki represents entropy, the thing that happens to everything eventually. No structure holds forever, no wall stays up, no oath is unbroken, no god survives their own story. Loki isn't the villain, he's the reminder that everything built can fall, and it will. Freyja wasn't technically one of the Aesir gods, she was Vanir from an older family of gods, a different tribe entirely. The Vanir were gods of fertility, cider, magic, nature, sex, and wealth. Their world was not the realm of war or kingship, but of cycles, of land, of life, and of the uncanny. When the Aesir and the Vanir went to war back in the mythic prehistory of the cosmos, the battles were so brutal, so evenly matched, that neither side could win. Eventually they brokered peace, a hostage exchange. From the Vanir, the Aesir received Freyja and her brother Freyr, and her father Njord. The Aesir didn't know it yet, but they had just accidentally invited the most powerful magician in the universe into their halls. Freyja brought with her the practice of cedar, a form of Norse magic so ancient, so strange, that even Odin himself had to beg her to teach it to him. Cedar was the art of weaving fate, of seeing into the future, of altering the threads that bind the world together. It was an act of both vision and manipulation, a terrifying power, a dangerous one. In fact, in many Norse sources, cedar is considered morally suspicious, gender-bending, disruptive. It was magic that made its user liminal, someone who stood between worlds, between genders, between categories. Odin's adoption of it was seen as shameful by other gods, something that marked him as ergi unmanly, deviant. But for Freyja this was simply how the world worked. Freyja was a paradox, a goddess of war, a goddess of love, a goddess of death, a goddess of wealth, a goddess of magic, all at once, and never separate. Most people today remember Freyja as a goddess of beauty and love. And that's true, but only partly, and she was the goddess of desire, and desire in the Norse world was not a soft thing. It was dangerous. It was power. To desire something was to risk everything, and to be desired was to be hunted. There's a reason Freyja's most famous possession was a necklace Brisingamen, for it glittered like fire. The myths differ on how she acquired it. Some say she seduced the dwarves, some say she traded, some say she simply paid. But the gods feared it, because Brisingamen wasn't just jewellery. It was power condensed into an object, beauty made into a weapon. Loki once stole it, Odin once demanded it as payment, but Freyja always took it back. And she was more than just the goddess of love, she was also the goddess of the slain. This is the part that surprises most people. When warriors died in battle, half of them didn't go to Valhalla. Half of them went to Freyja's Hall Folkvanga, a place just as glorious, just as honourable as Odin's war barracks, maybe more so. The sagas don't explain why, but the implication is this Freyja chose her dead first. This was not sentimentality, this was sovereignty. Freyja ruled the fields of the dead the same way she ruled the realms of the living, through desire, through magic, through choice. It is easy to forget, when reading the surviving myths, that most of the stories were recorded by Christian writers long after Norse paganism had faded. Stories about Freyja were softened, sanitized, or twisted into moral warnings. But look closely and a different Freyja emerges. Freyja cried tears of gold when her husband Odur disappeared. No one knows where he went. Some say he wandered the world. Some say he fled her. Some say he was Odin himself under another name. She searched the worlds for him, crossing the 9 realms, looking, longing. Her grief was alchemical. Her tears became precious metal. Her loss transmuted into wealth. The Norse understood something modern minds forget, that grief and love are the same muscle, that desire is a form of suffering, and that suffering creates value. Freya was that truth made flesh. She was the goddess of sex, yes, but also of death, of beauty, of mourning, of power, of wealth, and of the dangerous bargains that tie them together, and she was a war goddess in her own terrifying way. Freya could ride into battle on a chariot pulled by cats. Not metaphorical cats, literal ones, giant, spectral, otherworldly cats, because if you think love is gentle, you've never seen what love looks like when it's betrayed. She was invoked for both marriage and murder, for fertility and for victory. Unlike Thor or Odin, she did not wield a hammer or a spear. Her weapon was desire itself. Her battlefield was the web of fate, the negotiation, the enchantment, the quiet bargain that decides who lives, who dies, and who thrives. But there is one more layer. One final strangeness. Freya, the myths say, was also a shapeshifter. She owned a cloak of falcon feathers with it. She could fly between worlds, between realities. She could cross the boundary between the dead and the living, between the gods and the giants, between the known and the unknown. That cloak appears again and again in the myths. When Loki needed to fly to the land of the giants to solve some crisis of his own making, he borrowed it with her permission. That was Freyja's power. She was not only a goddess of magic, she was the magic that made the world coherent, the connective tissue, the thing that made the boundaries negotiable, the force that made the impossible possible. And yet, Freya, for all her power, is one of the few gods whose death is never described in the myths. At Ragnarok we know that Odin falls, that Thor falls, that Loki falls, but Freya's fate is left unwritten. Perhaps the seeresses who sang the end of the world simply refused to speak it, or perhaps because even death doesn't know how to claim her. Ragnarok. The word itself sounds like breaking glass, like splintered shields and cracked tree roots. It comes from Old Norse, Ragnarökr, meaning the fate of the gods or the twilight of the powers. Not necessarily the end of the world, but the end of this version of it. The Norse didn't believe in final endings the way modern apocalyptic myths do. There was no clean slate, no white-robed paradise after the fires burned out. Instead, Ragnarok was a cycle, a collapse, a necessary correction in the cosmic code. But it wasn't a surprise. The gods always knew it was coming, and they always knew they couldn't stop it. It begins with signs, warnings. The unravelling starts small. First, there will be 3 consecutive winters with no summer in between. 3 years of cold, hunger and darkness. Crops will fail. Brothers will turn on brothers, fathers on sons. The social order will break. No king will hold his throne. No farm will yield a harvest. Wolves will hunt at the edges of human settlements. Famine and murder will dance together. Then the monsters will rise. Fenrir the wolf will break free from his chains. The same wolf the gods tricked into captivity with impossible bindings. He will run with jaws so wide they stretch from heaven to earth. Wherever he moves, the sky will tremble. Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent, will rise from the sea, sending tidal waves crashing into the shores of every land. Poison will drip from his fangs. The air and water will sour. Fish will die. Coasts will vanish. From the land of the dead, Hel will send forth her legions. Ships made from the fingernails of the dead will sail from Helheim, carrying armies of corpses and giants. Even Loki, still bound, still burning with venom from the snake above him, will break free from his subterranean prison. The earthquake that shatters his bonds will signal the opening move of the final war. On the eastern horizon, the fire giants of Muspelheim will march, led by Surtur, the primordial force of fire. With his flaming sword, Surtur will scorch the earth as he walks. The Bifrost, the rainbow bridge that connects Asgard to the human world, will shatter under their feet, and at the head of it all Loki, smiling. The gods will rally. They always knew this day would come. Odin will mount Sleipnir, his 8-legged horse, and ride to consult the head of Mimir for final counsel. He will gather his Ainarjar warriors from Valhalla, men chosen from the dead to fight at his side. Thor will lift Mjolnir, knowing he will never see another sunrise. Freyja will lead her chosen dead from Folkvanger. Freyr, god of harvest and peace, will march into battle weaponless, having long ago traded away his magic sword in a short-sighted bargain of love. Tyr, the god of law and war, will square off against Garm, the monstrous hound of hell. Even Heimdall, the watchman of the gods, will blow his great horn, the Gjallarhorn, calling all realms to witness the end. The gods will meet their enemies on the plains of Vigrid, a battlefield spanning 100 leagues in every direction. There will be no parley, no diplomacy, only war. The deaths will be immediate and poetic. Odin will confront Fenrir, the All-Father, the one who spent eternity gathering knowledge, sacrificing eyes, seeking wisdom, will be devoured by the same wolf he once feared enough to chain. Thor will finally slay Jörmungandr, hammering the serpent until it lies broken and still. But after walking only 9 steps, Thor too will collapse, poisoned beyond cure. Freyr will fall to Surtur, unable to defend himself without the sword he once traded away. Tyr and Garm will kill each other. Heimdall and Loki likewise. The sky will go black. The stars will vanish. The sun and moon, hunted down by their pursuing wolves, Shul and Hati, will be caught and swallowed. The earth itself will sink beneath the waves. Mountains will crumble. Forests will burn. The oceans will boil. And in the final act, Surtur will fling fire across the 9 worlds, reducing everything gods, men, giants, monsters to ash. And then silence. The Norse did not imagine this silence as a void of nothingness. It was more like the silence after a funeral pyre, smoke rising, embers cooling, and then something new. Because Ragnarok was not just an ending, it was a reset. Out of the sea, the earth will rise again green and reborn. Rivers will run, crops will grow, the sun will reappear, reborn from the daughter of the sun who escaped into the future before the devouring. 2 human survivors, Leif and Lifthrasir, will emerge from a forest called Hod Mimis Holt, where they hid during the chaos. They will repopulate the world. A few gods will survive as well. Baldur, the murdered god of light, will return from the underworld. His blind brother Hörder will walk beside him, forgiven. Thor's sons, Magni and Modi, will inherit Mjolnir. They will carry their father's strength forward. Even Vidar and Vali, sons of Odin, will survive, stepping out of the wreckage to begin again. There will be no paradise, no eternal peace. But life will resume, as it always does. And that is the terrible, beautiful truth of Ragnarok. It is not a Christian-style apocalypse. It is not a morality play where the righteous are saved and the wicked punished. It is not a binary fight between good and evil. It is entropy, cosmic physics. The Norse saw it coming, accepted it, and chose to fight anyway, to live knowing that death would come, to love knowing that everything loved would vanish, to stand, hammer raised, sword drawn, breath held, not to escape fate, but to meet it on their feet. Swinging. And that is why Ragnarok is more than just a story. It's a worldview, a way to exist inside a doomed system and still care enough to defend it. Until the bitter, burning, beautiful end. Valhalla. The word alone feels heavy, old, saturated with the smell of blood, wood smoke and iron. In Old Norse, it means the Hall of the Slain, a place where dead warriors drink, fight, and wait for a war that will never end until it truly ends. But Valhalla wasn't heaven, not in the way modern audiences might imagine. It wasn't peaceful, it wasn't a reward for moral virtue, it wasn't about being a good person, it was about dying the right way. To enter Valhalla, you had to die in battle, not just in any battle, in heroic battle, with your weapon in your hand, your blood still hot, your will still defiant. No sickness, no cowardice, no quiet endings, only death by violence. And even then, entry wasn't guaranteed, because the Norse believed that every warrior killed in battle was first judged and then divided. Half went to Valhalla, the other half went to Folkvangr, Freya's field of the fallen. And the gods they got to choose. The chooser was Odin, or more precisely his shield maidens of fate, the Valkyries. The Valkyries weren't winged angels. They weren't soft, glowing maidens with flowing hesse hair and flower crowns. They were battle spirits, choosers of the slain. Their name literally means chooser of the fallen. To the Norse, Valkyries were terrifying and sacred. They rode through the battlefield on horseback. They carried spears, wore armour. In some stories, they could shape the outcome of battles themselves, causing arrows to miss or making swords land their mark. When a warrior fell, it It wasn't random who lived and who died. The Valkyries chose, not always for reasons mortals could understand. The poet said that sometimes, before a battle, warriors would look up and see strange women standing on the air above the field, watching, waiting, sometimes weaving with entrails for thread, sometimes riding wolves, sometimes drinking blood from skulls. If you saw them, your fate was already decided, but for those the Valkyries marked, the ride to Valhalla was next. Imagine this: you die with your axe raised, your shield splintered, your breath cut short, and in that moment you wake again, not on the battlefield, but galloping through the sky, the Valkyries lifting you away, you arrive at Valhalla, and it's nothing like a church, nothing like paradise. It's a long, endless hall with a roof made of golden shields, spears for rafters, the benches lined with warriors, all of them laughing, drinking, shouting, singing, and eating. Every day the gods cook, and Hrimnir slaughters the same magical beast, the boar Sahrimnir, who is cooked in a massive cauldron and served to the warriors. Every night the boar resurrects, ready to be cooked again the next day. To drink they're served mead, not from a brewery but from a goat. Heidrun, the goat of Valhalla, feeds on the branches of the world tree and produces endless streams of sweet mead from her udders. The dead warriors fill their horns and drink until they fall asleep on the floor, and every morning they wake up healed, fresh, whole, and ready to fight again, because that's the point of Valhalla. Every day the warriors dress, arm themselves, and pour out into the fields outside the hall, and they fight. Not in practice, not with blunted swords, they fight to the death. Limbs are hacked off, skulls are split, blood soaks the earth, and at sunset everyone rises again, whole, restored. The blood vanishes, the bodies return, and the warriors stumble back into the hall laughing, drinking, shouting about who killed who, and in the morning they'll do it all again. Because Valhalla wasn't the reward, it was the training ground, the waiting room, the army being prepared for Ragnarok. Odin was not gathering these men out of kindness, or mercy, or love. He was stockpiling them, because when Fenrir broke free, when the serpent rose, when the giants marched, Odin would need every sword he could get. So day after day, year after year, century after century, the warriors of Valhalla rehearsed for a war that hadn't come yet. A war Odin knew he would still lose. But that was the thing about Norse cosmology. You fight even when you know you're doomed. You stand even when you know the ground is going to break beneath you. You raise your shield even if the sun won't rise tomorrow. Because fighting mattered. Because defiance mattered. Because how you die says everything about how you lived. But not every Norse warrior dreamed of Valhalla. Some hoped for Folkvangr, Freyja's hall. Some, weary of war, didn't care where they went, as long as it wasn't Helheim, and most never saw any afterlife at all, because in the end, all myths are promises. Valhalla was one such promise. A golden hall built on top of fear, a place where warriors became symbols, where memory became muscle, where death became rehearsal, for a battle that still hasn't happened, yet. The first thing to understand is this. Ragnar Lothbrok is a paradox, a man made of myth, a man made of maybe. The historical records do not agree on whether he lived. No single text confirms him, and yet dozens reference him. Sagas, poems, chronicles from Iceland to France to England to the monasteries of Christian scribes who prayed his name would never come near their shores again. A ghost in the footnotes of history, a nightmare that somehow walked. The stories say he was a king of Denmark, or of Sweden, or of both, or neither. Sometimes a chieftain, sometimes a pirate, sometimes a crowned ruler with a fleet so vast it blocked the horizon. His name Lothbrok means hairy breeches. According to the sagas, he earned this charming title after slaying a giant serpent to win the hand of his first wife, Thora Borgarjotr. He fashioned trousers from animal hides, boiled them in pitch, and wore them into battle against the venomous monster, protecting himself from its fangs and poison. From then on, the man was called Ragnar Lothbrok, Ragnar Hairy Breeches, because why not? This is how saga logic works. And yet beneath the absurdity, the poetry, and the stitched-together mythologies, something real pulses. Multiple figures in 9th century records resemble Ragnar. Some historians think he is an amalgamation, a legendary composite of several notorious Viking leaders whose stories bled together across generations. But whether real, invented, or both, the story of Ragnar is the story of the Viking explosion itself, the collision of north and south, of sea and shore, of raider and ruler. The sagas tell us that Ragnar married 3 women. First Thora, whose hand he won by killing the serpent. Then Lagertha, a shield maiden from Norway, fierce in battle, who saved his life during a civil war. He met her after the death of Thora. According to Saxo Grammaticus, the medieval chronicler, Lagertha fought with her hair loose, leading a battalion of women warriors, and when Ragnar asked for her hand she agreed, but only after he proved himself worthy of her wildness. The marriage did not last, but the myth did. His final wife, and the most famous in legend, was Aslaug, a woman of high lineage said to be the daughter of the dragon slayer Sigurd and the shield maiden Brynhilda from the older Volsunga legends. Aslaug was clever, prophetic and wise. The sagas describe how Ragnar, testing her intelligence, asked her to come to him neither clothed nor unclothed, neither fasting nor eating, neither alone nor in company. She arrived dressed in a fishing net, nibbling on an onion, accompanied only by a dog. She passed the test, and became the queen of Ragnar's most legendary children. And oh, those children. If Ragnar himself is a question mark in history, his sons are exclamation points. Ivar the Boneless, a tactical genius, feared as much for his mind as for his rumoured physical deformity. Some say he was crippled, others that he was snake-like, boneless, uncanny. Bjorn Ironside, the adventurer, the explorer, said to have sailed as far as the Mediterranean, raiding the coasts of Italy, North Africa, even reaching the Byzantine Empire. Sigurd Snake in the Eye, named for the strange serpent-shaped mark in his eye. Hvitserk, the shadowy one less is known but no less feared. Together these sons would one day form the great heathen army, a Viking force so massive, so coordinated, that it would conquer nearly all of Anglo-Saxon England. And the reason for that army was Ragnar's death. Ragnar's most famous raid was on the kingdom of Northumbria, in what is now northern England. The sagas claim that Ragnar, against the advice of Aslaug, set sail with only a small force, driven by arrogance, curiosity and a hunger for glory. His ships were wrecked in a storm. He was captured by King Ella of Northumbria, and Ella Humsas did not show mercy. According to legend, Ragnar was thrown into a pit of snakes, poisonous, biting, hissing. As they struck him over and over, Ragnar, defiant to the last, laughed and sang. His death song is one of the most famous fragments of Viking poetry ever recorded. The piglets will grunt when they hear how the old boar died. A warning, a promise. His sons were coming, and come they did. In the year now called 865, the great heathen army crossed the sea, bigger than any Viking force before it. Not a raid, not a plunder mission, but a war of conquest. The first to fall was York. King Ella was captured, and the sons of Ragnar, in repayment for their father's death, inflicted upon him the most infamous execution in the Viking imagination, the Blood Eagle. They carved open his back, broke the ribs from the spine, pulled the lungs out through the wound, spreading them like wings. Whether the Blood Eagle was ever truly practiced is debated by historians. Some say it was real, others argue it was poetic hyperbole, a literary revenge invented by later storytellers. But whether real or myth, it became real in memory. And that's the point. What made Ragnar so enduring wasn't just the raids, it wasn't just the legends, it was what he represented. He was the Viking archetype made flesh, a man who refused to kneel, a man whose death became the reason for the first true Viking invasion, not of monasteries, but of kingdoms. His story is the story of the Viking transformation, from pirates to conquerors, from seasonal raiders to map writers, from whispers on the tide to the architects of political change in England, France, Ireland and beyond. And yet the irony is this: Ragnar never wanted to build an empire. His myth is not one of kingship, not one of governance. It's a story of hunger, of motion, of testing the edge of the world simply because the edge was there. In that way, Ragnar was not the king of the Vikings. He was their ghost, their echo, the first ripple in a wave that would keep moving for the next 3 centuries. Whether he lived, or whether the sagas stitched him together from many dead men's memories, hardly matters now, because history forgot the borders between fact and story long ago. Ragnar Lothbrok exists because we remember him, and remembering is the only real immortality. It begins with a funeral that never happened. Ragnar Lothbrok dead in the snake pit, his bones abandoned to rot in Northumbrian soil. His death song echoing through time did not fade. It reached across the sea, to Denmark, to Norway, to the halls of his sons, and what those sons did next rewrote the map of medieval Europe. They were not alike, not in strength, not in temperament, not in ambition. If anything, they were rivals as much as brothers, but the one thing they shared was the oath to avenge their father. The sagas say there were many sons, perhaps 7, perhaps more, but 4 names rise again and again through both legend and historical record. Ivar the Boneless, the tactician, the mind of the army. His epithet, the Boneless, has baffled scholars for centuries. Some say it referred to a genetic disorder, perhaps brittle bones or hypermobility, or even a form of osteogenesis imperfecta. Others argue it was poetic, describing someone serpent-like, fluid in movement, able to slip through battle without harm. The most cynical argue it was a mistranslation, and that it simply meant legless, a reference to being carried on a shield due to a disabling injury. But none of it mattered to the men who followed him, because when Ivar gave orders, cities burned. Ivar was not a berserker. He was not the first to rush into the shield wall. He was the one who broke it from behind through strategy, manipulation, and siegecraft. In some ways, Ivar was less Viking, more general, less about the raid, more about the war. Bjorn Ironside, the explorer, the adventurer. His epithet was earned either through invulnerability in battle. His enemy's blades could not pierce his armour, or, more likely, from his iron-hard will. Where Ivar sought kingdoms, Bjorn sought horizons. The sagas say he sailed beyond the boundaries of the known world to the Mediterranean, to the coasts of Spain, Italy, even North Africa. Some claim he tricked the defenders of Luna, Italy, by pretending to be dead. His crew begged the city to allow a Christian burial inside the walls. Once granted, Bjorn leapt from his coffin with his sword drawn. The gates opened from within. Whether the story is true doesn't matter. What matters is that it was told and retold. Bjorn was the Viking spirit of endless movement, of curiosity dressed in violence. Sigurd Snake in the Eye, named for a literal serpent-shaped mark in his eye, twisted like the Ouroboros, the world serpent that devours its own tail. Sigurd was the political one, the builder of power, the son who stayed behind when others voyaged. He inherited the Danish heartland, becoming a king in name, not just title. While Ivar and Bjorn expanded outward, Sigurd made sure there was still a throne left to return to. His reign would eventually lead to the foundation of powerful Scandinavian dynasties that shaped Europe for generations. Hvitserk, the shadow among the famous, less is known. The sagas split him in strange ways, sometimes describing him as a brother, other times as a nickname for one of the others, perhaps even for Bjorn himself. But the most common thread holds that Hvitserk joined his brothers in the campaigns against the Franks and the Slavs. One story says that after being captured during an ill-fated campaign, he was executed by being burned alive on a pyre of human skulls. Whether true or symbolic, it tells you what mattered. In the Viking world, even the way you died was a kind of poetry. Together, they orchestrated one of the most terrifying military campaigns the British Isles had ever seen, the arrival of the Great Heathen Army in the year now called 865. But this was no mindless raid. This was systematic. The army first landed in East Anglia. The local king, Edmund, chose to pay them tribute rather than fight. Ivar accepted the payment, but he wasn't there for gold. He was there to establish control. From East Anglia, the army moved north to York, then a major trading hub. They captured it, fortified it, made it their own, and then they hunted King Ella. When Ella was captured, the sagas say the brothers performed the infamous Blood Eagle, cutting open his back, breaking his ribs outward and pulling out the lungs to make them look like wings. Some scholars dispute whether this ritual execution ever truly occurred. But one thing is clear, the Anglo-Saxon chroniclers believed it, and belief shapes reality. But the Great Heathen Army didn't stop. They marched south. They shattered kingdoms. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex. Each was targeted, tested, pushed to the brink. Only Wessex under Alfred the Great would ultimately survive, barely, and even then only through a brutal campaign of guerrilla warfare, fort construction, and cultural resilience that would one day become the foundation of England itself. But the sons of Ragnar didn't just fight in England. Bjorn turned toward the west and the south into the Mediterranean. His ships reached as far as Sicily. He raided the coasts of North Africa. He fought against Muslim fleets, Byzantine cities, and Christian kingdoms. His was a piracy of scale the world had never seen before. Ivar moved east, into Ireland, into Scotland, into the Fraxius kingdoms where Viking warbands had already begun to carve out petty kingdoms. Dublin became a Norse stronghold, a slave market, a pirate republic, and then something more, a multicultural city of Norse, Gaelic, and slave populations living in tension and transaction. Sigurd fortified Scandinavia itself. He ruled, managed, ensured that the machine of war could still produce ships, warriors, and gold. Hvitserk fought in the east. Some stories say he raided as far as Kiev and the lands of the Rus. But here is the dark truth the sagas do not say outright. The sons of Ragnar were not a family in the sense we might imagine. They were a dynasty, a fracturing web of ambition, betrayal, and divergent dreams. Some sought glory, some sought power, some sought the edge of the world, and when the dust settled, most of them died violently, or vanished from the record. Ivar, despite his cunning, likely died childless, his nickname Boneless interpreted by some as a euphemism for impotence. Bjorn's line went on. His descendants became kings in Sweden. Sigurd's descendants became the royal line of Denmark. Hvitserk disappears. But their legacy was never about personal survival. It was about the transformation of the Viking world, from raiders into settlers into kings. The Danelaw, Normandy, Dublin, York, Kiev, Iceland, Greenland, even the short-lived Vinland in North America. These were not isolated dots. They were threads in the web the sons of Ragnar helped spin, a web made of violence, of trade, of marriage, of memory, and in that web you can still hear Ragnar's death song. The piglets will grunt when they hear how the old boar died. And grunt they did, and the world was never the same. The sons of Ragnar had carved their vengeance deep into the British Isles. But once the great heathen army fractured, the Viking Age entered a new chapter. No longer were these isolated raids by seasonal warbands. The Viking world had tasted empire, and it wanted more. In England, the lands conquered by the sons of Ragnar became known as the Danelaw, a region where Norse law, Norse language, and Norse customs governed daily life. Cities like York became Viking strongholds. Markets bustled with silver from Baghdad, furs from Sweden, slaves from Ireland, and wine from Francia. A strange hybrid culture emerged where Anglo-Saxon and Norse intermarried, shared languages, and wove a new identity from both. But the Danelaw was not the only Viking kingdom. To the west, the Norse seized Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, Cork and Wexford, turning Ireland into a patchwork of Viking cities. Dublin in particular became infamous as one of the largest slave markets in the Western world. The Irish resisted, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But the Norse weren't just raiders anymore, they were also traders, kings, landlords. Further east, the Swedish Vikings, known as the Ruts, pressed deep into the river systems of Eastern Europe. They founded Novgorod, then Kiev. They struck trade deals with the Byzantine Empire, and even stormed the gates of Constantinople multiple times, only to end up, ironically, being hired as the Byzantine Emperor's personal bodyguard, the infamous Varangian Guard. 6-foot-tall, blonde-haired Northmen wielding battle-axes, protecting the very civilization they once tried to sack. But perhaps the most surreal Viking transformation happened in the heart of Francia. In the year now called 911, a Viking warlord named Rollo laid siege to Paris. By this point the Franks were exhausted. They had spent the better part of a century paying Viking armies to leave, to stop, to go away. But Rollo didn't go away. So King Charles the Simple did something radical. He offered Rollo a deal: land. Specifically a large chunk of northern France. In exchange, Rollo would defend the coast against other Vikings. He would convert to Christianity. He would become, legally and officially, a Duke of Francia. Rollo accepted, sort of. The legend goes that when asked to kiss the king's foot in submission, Rollo refused. Instead, he ordered one of his men to do it. The man grabbed the king's foot and yanked it so hard the king fell backward. Diplomacy Viking style. The land Rollo received became Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Within 2 generations, these Vikings were speaking French, building castles, and preparing for one of the most consequential invasions in history. Because in the year 1066, a descendant of Rollo, a man named William the Conqueror, sailed across the English Channel and seized the English crown at the Battle of Hastings. A Viking, on the throne of England. The echo of Ragnar was still ringing. Meanwhile, in the icy Atlantic, the Viking diaspora pushed west. Iceland had already become a Norse republic, governed by the Althing, one of the world's oldest parliaments. Greenland followed. Colonised by Eric the Red, a man so charming he convinced hundreds of people to settle a frozen wasteland by calling it Greenland, and then came Vinland. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed further west and reached North America. The sagas say they found wild grapes, fertile lands, and strange people they called the Skraelings, likely the ancestors of modern Inuit or First Nations peoples. But Vinland did not last. The Norse could not hold it. Whether from distance, internal conflict, or war with the indigenous peoples, the settlement was abandoned. The dream of a Viking America faded into myth. And yet the ruins still stand in Newfoundland today, a quiet, stubborn testament to how far the Norse pushed the edge of the known world. Back in Scandinavia, the Viking world was beginning to fracture not because they failed, but because they succeeded. Kingship replaced chieftains. Centralized power replaced independent warbands. Denmark became a kingdom, Sweden became a kingdom, Norway became a kingdom, and with kingdoms came taxes, bureaucracy, state religion. The wild pagan freedom of the early Viking age started to choke beneath the weight of order. Christianity spread not through sword and flame, but through trade, through marriage, through slow cultural erosion. The gods of Asgard faded. Odin, Thor, Freya says. Replaced by the cross, replaced by Christ, but the sword didn't go quietly. The final act of the Viking Age played out in England. After centuries of back-and-forth raids, settlements and reconquest, the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard succeeded where no Viking before him had. He conquered the entirety of England in the year 1014. His son, Canute the Great, ruled not only England, but Denmark, Norway and parts of Sweden. For a brief surreal moment, the Viking world was an empire. A North Sea empire that bound together Scandinavia and Britain under one crown. Canute wasn't just a warlord. He was a statesman. He styled himself as a Christian king, attended mass, paid clerics, built churches, and yet he still held the blood of Ragnar in his veins. But even empires fade. Canute's sons could not hold what he built. Internal conflicts and the growing power of rival kingdoms, especially the Normans, fractured the empire. By the mid-11th century, the last Viking king of England was defeated. And then came Hastings, William the Conqueror, a Viking by blood, a Frenchman by culture. He crossed the sea and ended Anglo-Saxon England forever. But even that was not the end. Vikings had long since stopped being just Norse. They were now Normans, Russ, Icelanders, Irish Norse. They were traders in Baghdad, bodyguards in Byzantium, kings in Dublin, farmers in Greenland, poets in Iceland. The Viking world never really ended. It dissolved. It evolved. It became us. Because the greatest Viking raid of all wasn't about silver, or slaves, or land. It was a raid on history itself, a theft of memory, a conquest of narrative. The Vikings did not vanish. They became legend, and legend never dies. All right, friend, let's end where all endings begin quietly, almost imperceptibly, the way a tide slips away without anyone noticing until the sand is cold beneath their feet. This is the story of how the Vikings disappeared, or perhaps more accurately, how they never really did. The myth always ends the same way. The sails vanish from the horizon, the raids stop, the longships are dragged ashore and left to rot in the grass. The world forgets, or pretends to. It's a comforting story, the idea that the Vikings were a chapter with a clean ending. But real endings are never clean, and the Viking Age didn't die, it dissolved. It unravelled slowly, not into ruin, but into transformation. The first crack wasn't swords, it wasn't politics, it was the weather. Around the late 13th century, the North Atlantic slipped into what historians call the Little Ice Age. Winters grew longer, summers shorter, crops failed, sea ice expanded, and for the Norse colonies clinging to the far edges of the world, Iceland, Greenland and Vinland, the margin for survival was already paper thin. In Greenland, it was a death sentence. Eric the Red's great gamble had always been a fragile lie. Greenland was never green, not really. It was a marketing slogan dressed up as geography. The settlers survived by exporting walrus ivory, hides and narwhal tusks to Europe, luxury goods that funded their precarious existence in an unforgiving land. But by the 14th century, demand collapsed. Elephant ivory returned to European markets from Africa. Trade routes shifted. The ships came less often, then they stopped coming entirely. The last written record from the Greenland Norse is from the year 1415, a church wedding. After that, nothing. No more ships, no more letters, no more news. Archaeologists would later find the bones, not piled in mass graves, not hacked apart by the enemies. No, they were found beneath abandoned farmhouses, beneath collapsed roofs, the cattle pens empty, the tools rusted exactly where they had been left. People didn't flee, they didn't fight, they stayed until the very end, and then the ice took them. But Greenland was just the outer edge. The rest of the Viking world wasn't buried in snow, it was buried in something quieter. Bureaucracy, borders, tax codes, churches. The Viking world collapsed because it succeeded. The moment you settle, you change. The sons of Ragnar had wanted land, they got it. But land comes with neighbours, with borders, with rulers. The Norse who settled in England became part of the Danelaw, until the Danelaw became part of England. The Norse in Normandy became Normans, and the Normans became indistinguishable from the Franks until they conquered England and made the Anglo-Norman identity the foundation of modern Britain. The Rus turned their longships into river towns into principalities, principalities into kingdoms, until they were no longer Vikings, they were Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, still bearing the fossil of the name Rus but speaking Slavic tongues, worshipping Orthodox saints, fighting wars in the name of crowns rather than gods. Even Iceland, the stubborn republic, eventually bent to the same gravity. Internal feuds escalated, the chieftain families grew too powerful. In the year 1262, the Free State collapsed, and Iceland voluntarily entered into a union with the Norwegian crown. It was the beginning of the end. The raids had already ended long before. The golden age of pillaging was not endless. By the 11th century, Europe had armoured itself. Fortified harbours, stone castles, standing navies. The soft underbelly that the first Viking raiders had exploited monasteries left undefended. Coastal towns too poor to wall themselves no longer existed. A monastery that had been burned in 800 would, by 1100, have walls, garrisons, and a bishop with political teeth sharper than any sword. The easy targets were gone, and with them went the economic incentive for raiding. It wasn't a moral shift, it was math. There were better ways to get rich. Some say it was Christianity that ended the Viking world. That's a partial truth. It is true that when the Norse adopted Christianity slowly, reluctantly, often cynically, the old pagan glue that bound the Viking identity began to dissolve. The raiding cult, the warrior cosmology of Odin and Valhalla, the bloody sacrifice of animals and sometimes men, these rituals had stitched Viking society together. A shared language, a shared contract with the gods. But as churches rose where pagan groves had stood, as baptism replaced blood, that contract frayed, and with it, the idea of being a Viking itself. Because Viking was never an ethnicity, never a nation. It was a verb. To go Viking was to take to the sea in search of wealth. If wealth could now be made by trade, by law, by marriage, then there was no need to risk your skull on a foreign shore. The sails came down, the swords went quiet, but disappearance is not death. The Norse did not vanish, they were absorbed. In every place they had touched, something remained. The English language half built from Norse words. Window, sky, knife, die, law. The Russian name itself, Rus, a fossil of Swedish Vikings rowing the river highways. The legal traditions of Normandy, of Iceland, of Dublin, shaped by Norse customs long after the last longship had rotted into peat. Even the genetic echoes. Modern DNA studies show that significant percentages of the populations of England, Ireland, Scotland, and parts of France still carry Scandinavian markers, not invaders, not foreigners, grandparents. And then there's the memory. The strangest survival of all. Because long after the real Vikings were gone, a second Viking age was born not of sails, but of stories. In the Romantic era of the 19th century, artists, poets, and historians in Britain, Scandinavia, and Germany resurrected the Viking as a symbol, a fantasy, a weapon. The image of the horned, helmeted barbarian, the heroic seafarer, the wild pagan. These were inventions, projections of modern anxieties about masculinity, nationalism, and the frontier. Writers romanticized the Viking sagas. Architects built Neo-Norse halls. Nationalists in Scandinavia invoked the Vikings as symbols of their pure ancient bloodlines, often conveniently forgetting the inconvenient parts about multiculturalism, slavery, and intermarriage. Even the Nazis would later twist Viking symbols into banners of racial mythology. 1,000 years after the real Viking world had ended, the myth was more alive than ever, a ghost wearing a horned helmet. But the truth is quieter, stranger, and more human. The Vikings disappeared the same way most things disappear. Not in fire, not in war, but in paperwork, in marriage contracts, in tax codes, in the slow, inexorable pull of the mundane. A farm instead of a raid, a church instead of a ship burial, a crown instead of a helm. They did not die. They became everyone else. And yet, if you listen closely in the place names, in the language, in the echoes of lore and story, the sails are still out there, fading into the mist, but never quite gone. And that, friend, is the end of the story, or perhaps just the end of the chapter. Because the pattern that repeats always has one more cycle left in it.